They didn't even look at her. That was the part that stayed with Eliza Mae Carter long after the laughter faded, not the words, not the pointing, but the way every single man in that circle turned his body away from her like she wasn't worth the energy of a proper rejection. Hank Dooley, the blacksmith's son with the square jaw and the proud belly he never acknowledged, actually stepped sideways to close the gap she might have filled, like a door being shut in slow motion, like she was a draft someone wanted to block. She was standing 10 feet from the platform in the center of Dustmere's main square, holding a canvas bag full of her father's account ledgers, because she'd been on her way to the bank when the gathering started, and she'd made the mistake of stopping to watch. That was all she'd done. Stop to watch. Now 50 people were watching her instead. If you've ever been in a room where everyone laughs at the same moment, and you're the only one who doesn't know why, and then you realize it's you, then you already know what Eliza felt, standing in that square on a Thursday afternoon in late October, with the wind picking up from the north and the sky turning the color of a bruise. Before we go any further, if stories like this one find something real in you, something you don't always have words for, please subscribe to this channel and follow Eliza's story all the way to the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Dustmere, Texas, and to the moment everything changed. Dustmere was not a cruel town by nature. It was simply a tired one. It had been settled 31 years earlier by cattle families and opportunists who'd come west with big plans and stayed because leaving felt like admitting defeat. By the time Eliza was born, the town had calcified into its habits who mattered. Who didn't? Who got a seat at the table and who was handed a broom to sweep under it. Nobody had written these rules down. Nobody needed to. They lived in the way men leaned toward certain women at Sunday dinners and turned their shoulders to others. They lived in the pauses before a shopkeeper set a price, a slight delay, while he decided whether to round up or down. Eliza had grown up reading those pauses, the way some people read weather. She was 28 years old and had been running her family's feed store for 4 of those years, since her father's back gave out and her mother's eyes started failing, and her younger brother Teddy turned out to be the kind of man who was always about to do something useful without ever quite doing it. The store was on the south end of Main Street, sandwiched between a saddle repair shop and a building that had been 3 different businesses, in 6 years, none of them surviving. Carter's feed and dry goods had survived because Eliza worked it, like survival was the only option available to her. Because for her family it was. She was not what Dustmere called a handsome woman. She knew this. She had known it since she was 11 years old, and Mabel Grissom told her so in the schoolyard with the flat certainty of someone delivering a weather report. Eliza had gone home that afternoon and looked at herself in the cracked mirror above the washstand. And she'd tried to see what Mabel saw the width of her, the way her arms filled her sleeves, the roundness that didn't arrange itself prettily, and she'd made a decision that she couldn't have articulated then, but understood now she would become useful. The world wasn't going to give her the things it gave to Mabel Grissom. She would build something the world needed instead. She had. The store was proof. The store's accounts, maintained in her precise, slightly cramped handwriting, were proof. The list of every rancher within 40 miles who owed Carter's money, and the separate list of those who were good for it, both lists memorized, both accurate, were proof. None of it meant anything to the men standing on the platform in Dustmere's main square on that Thursday afternoon, dividing up partners for the cattle drive supply expedition. The expedition had been organized by the Cattlemen's Council after a bad summer 3 ranches had run low on winter feed, and there was a coordinated push to get a supply wagon through to the northern grazing lands before the first real freeze. It required riders who knew the terrain and could handle 3 weeks on rough roads. The council had put together a list of eligible men and suggested they each choose a capable partner. Women weren't excluded by any written rule. They were simply never considered. Eliza had stopped because she recognized some of the names being called. She'd sold feed to half these men on credit. She knew which of them paid on time. Randall Pruitt called out Deputy Cass from the platform. He was running the selection because Sheriff Meade had a bad knee and preferred to supervise from the saloon doorway. Choose your partner. Randall was 24, blonde, and had the particular confidence of a man who'd never been wrong about anything important. He scanned the assembled crowd with theatrical deliberation. His eyes passed over Eliza without the faintest interruption in their movement. "Clara Hutchins," he said. And Clara, 19 and wearing a green dress that fit her like an opinion, stepped forward to a smattering of approving noise from the crowd. This happened 3 more times. Each time, Eliza told herself she was leaving. Each time, some stubborn, stupid part of her stayed. She wasn't sure what she was waiting for. She didn't want to be chosen by Randall Pruitt or any of his kind. She had approximately 0 interest in 3 weeks on a supply wagon with men who'd been calling her Big May behind her back since she was 15. She knew that's what they called her. She'd overheard it twice and been told about it a 3rd time by Ruthie Jacobs, who'd meant it as kindness and landed it like a stone. But she'd stopped walking, and now she was standing there. And people were starting to notice her standing there. And the problem with being the kind of woman Eliza was in a town like Dustmere was that you were visible in all the wrong moments and invisible in all the others. "Hank Dooley," called the deputy. Hank stepped forward, already grinning. He was popular in the way of men who've never had to try very hard good-looking enough, funny in a way that required an audience, possessing the social fluency of someone who'd always been liked. He made a show of looking around the square, and his gaze landed on Eliza, and he paused just long enough that something in her chest turned to ice. Then he laughed. It wasn't a vicious laugh. That was almost the worst part. It was a dismissive one, the kind of laugh you give to a joke that doesn't need explaining, because everyone already understands it. He looked around at the other men, spread his hands, and said, "Better keep looking." And someone in the crowd made a sound that wasn't quite laughter, but wasn't not laughter either. And Eliza felt the heat climb from her collarbone to her jaw. She did not cry. She'd learned a long time ago that crying in public in Dustmere was like bleeding in front of dogs. It only made things worse. She shifted the canvas bag on her shoulder and turned to leave, and that was when she heard it. A horse, walking, not running the measured pace of an animal that wasn't in a hurry because its rider never was. The sound came from the north end of Main Street, and it cut through the ambient noise of the gathering the way a crack cuts through ice, sudden, clean, changing everything about the surface underneath. She turned back without meaning to. The rider was maybe 35, lean in the way of men who worked too hard to carry extra weight, with dark hair under a battered hat and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in 4 or 5 days. He rode a gray horse with a white blaze down its nose and saddlebags that looked like they'd been repaired so many times the repairs had repairs. He wasn't from Dustmere. Eliza knew Dustmere's horses the way she knew its ledgers, and she'd never seen that gray before. He pulled up at the edge of the square and watched. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The way he watched was enough the kind of attention that didn't perform itself, that didn't announce itself, that simply was. He watched Hank Dooley still chuckling. He watched the deputy moving on to the next name. He watched Eliza starting to leave, bag over her shoulder, spine straight, giving them nothing. And then he watched the sky. Eliza saw him look up, and despite everything, despite the ice in her chest and the heat in her face, and the absolute certainty that she should be at the bank right now, and nowhere near this square she looked up to. The clouds were doing something. She'd been watching the sky her whole life, the way people who work with livestock and feed and supply routes have to, and she recognized immediately what she was seeing. The formation to the northwest was moving wrong. It wasn't just weather coming in, it was the kind of convergence that happened before a flash event, the kind that caught people in low ground. Canyon Road North, the one the expedition was planning to use, ran through 2 miles of flood-prone terrain. She forgot for one moment that she was humiliated. "The North Canyon Road," she said. She wasn't sure at first that she'd said it out loud, but the deputy glanced at her, and that answered the question. Can't take the expedition that way. Not with this weather moving in. The deputy looked at her the way men in Dustmere had looked at her for years, not hostilely, just with a particular quality of not quite hearing, like her voice operated on a frequency that only partially reached him. "There's a storm," she said, more clearly. "Look northwest. That's not just rain coming. The canyon road will flood. You've got maybe 6 hours before. We appreciate the concern. Eliza Mae," the deputy said, with the gentle condescension of someone telling a child that the adults have things in hand. Laughter moved through the crowd. Not everyone laughed, but enough. Hank Dooley said something to the man next to him, and both of them found it funny. And Eliza felt the canvas bag strap cut into her shoulder, because her grip had tightened without her noticing. It was the stranger who spoke then. He hadn't moved from his position at the edge of the square. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the way certain voices do not by volume, but by quality. By the sense that the person speaking had no interest in competing for airspace, and that were somehow following it by default. "She's right about the sky," he said. A small silence. Northwest convergence like that, with this temperature dropping. He paused, glancing up again with the ease of someone reading a familiar page. "Trail crews I've ridden with in Montana don't touch low canyon routes when they see that pattern. Lost 2 men that way years back, not to the storm itself, to what the storm does to the water underground before it reaches the surface." The deputy turned to look at him properly for the first time. "You know this country?" "Enough," the stranger said. He looked at Eliza. Not through her, not past her. At her. "She knows it better, I'd bet." It was not a dramatic moment. There was no music, no collective intake of breath. Hank Dooley rolled his eyes. The deputy looked vaguely uncomfortable. 2 women near the dry goods store exchanged a glance that Eliza couldn't read from where she stood. But something had shifted, the way the air shifts in the seconds before lightning, nothing visible yet, but something in the molecules changed. The stranger swung down from his horse with the unhurried ease of someone who dismounted 10,000 times and saw no reason to add ceremony to it. He looped his reins around the hitching post and looked at the deputy. "Colton Hayes," he said, "I've got a delivery to make to the Alderman Ranch, north of your expedition route. Figured I'd ride with your group partway, if that's acceptable." "You're welcome to," the deputy said. Colton Hayes nodded once. Then he turned and looked at Eliza again, and this time she was close enough to see that his eyes were the specific gray of creek water, in autumn not warm, not cold, simply very clear. "That canyon you mentioned," he said. "You've ridden it?" "I know the land around it," she said. She kept her voice level. She'd had practice. "I've delivered feed to every ranch in a 20-mile radius for 4 years. You learn the roads. The alternate routes, too?" She hadn't mentioned alternate routes. She looked at him carefully, the way she looked at a ledger she suspected of, containing an error not hostile, just precise. "Why? Because if you're right about the weather, and I think you are then, whoever leads this expedition is going to need someone who knows the alternate routes." The crowd was quieter now. Not silent, but quieter. People had started listening, in the way people do, when a conversation stops being background noise and starts being something else. Eliza looked at Colton Hayes. She looked at the assembled men of Dustmere Hank Dooley, with his arms crossed, Randall Pruitt examining his fingernails, the deputy, with his expression of polite uncertainty. She looked at the northwest sky, where the clouds were doing their slow, inexorable wrong thing. She thought about what she wanted to say, which was, "I know this land better than every man on that platform. I've known it for years, and I've been delivering feed through its worst weather, since I was 24 years old, and not one of you has ever once asked me anything about it." What she said instead was, "I'll think about it," which was, for Eliza Mae Carter, practically a declaration. She left the square without looking back. She had ledgers to deliver, and an account balance to argue about, and a store to get back to, before Teddy did something accidentally catastrophic with the pricing on the winter oat supply. But she took a different route than usual, the long way, so she could walk by the north end of town and look at the sky without anyone watching her do it. The clouds were moving, wrong and fast, and in exactly the way she'd said. She stood there for a moment, the canvas bag heavy on her shoulder, the wind picking up from the northwest with that particular bite that said the sky wasn't bluffing. She thought about Colton Hayes saying, "She knows it better, I'd bet." Nobody had said anything like that to her in a very long time. Possibly ever. She adjusted the bag and walked to the bank. But she was already thinking about the canyon. The bank took 40 minutes and resolved nothing. Eliza sat across from Gerald Fitch, who managed Dustmere's only lending institution, with the particular energy of a man who believed paperwork was a moral system. And she explained again, for the 3rd time in 2 months, that the late payment on the Carter account was not a sign of instability, but a consequence of the Alderman Ranch paying 60 days behind on their bulk order, which had created a gap in the store's cash flow that was temporary and documentable. Gerald Fitch listened, with his hands folded on his desk and his expression arranged into something he probably thought looked like sympathy, but actually looked like a man waiting for a pause, long enough to say no. Eliza Mae, he said. When she finished, your father built a fine business. My father's business is still fine, she said. I run it. Of course you do. The pause he inserted after that was doing a lot of work. We'll review the account at the end of the quarter. She walked out with the ledgers under her arm and the specific exhaustion that comes not from physical effort, but from having to explain yourself to someone who's already decided not to understand. The wind had picked up while she was inside. She felt it the moment she stepped onto the boardwalk, that northwest cold, sharper than it had been an hour ago, carrying a smell that anyone who'd grown up in open country would recognize. Not just rain. Something bigger and angrier than rain, moving in from somewhere that had been dealing with it longer than Dustmere had. She looked at the sky without stopping walking. The clouds she'd seen in the square had organized themselves while she was arguing with Gerald Fitch. That was the thing about bad weather. It didn't wait for you to finish your business. The formation was lower now, and darker at its base, and there was a greenish tint at the western edge that she didn't like at all. She'd seen that color once before, 6 years ago, when a storm had come through and taken the roof off the Pearson barn in 40 minutes flat. She did the math automatically, the way she did most things: distances, speeds, the rate at which that particular cloud structure typically moved against this particular wind direction. She came up with a number she didn't want to have. 6 hours had been generous. It might be 4. She changed direction without deciding to and walked toward the feed store. Teddy was behind the counter when she came in, doing something with the inventory list that she could tell at a glance was going to require correction. He was 25 and had their father's good nature and their mother's inability to stay organized, which in combination produced a person who was genuinely pleasant to be around and genuinely unreliable in any situation that required precision. "How'd the bank go?" he asked. "The way banks go," she said, which he understood to mean badly. She set the ledgers down and went to the back room, where she kept the maps. They weren't official maps, nothing published or surveyed with any real authority. They were her maps, accumulated over 4 years of delivery routes, hand-drawn on whatever paper she'd had available, annotated in her cramped writing with notes about road conditions and seasonal flooding and the particular tendencies of each stretch of terrain in different weather. She'd started making them because she'd gotten stuck twice in her first year of doing deliveries, once in mud and once in a dry creek bed that had decided to stop being dry at an inconvenient moment, and she'd decided that wasn't happening again. She pulled out the section covering the North Canyon route and spread it on the work table. The Canyon Road was the obvious choice for the expedition. It was the most direct, the best maintained, and the one every rancher in the district used for bulk transport. It ran through a narrow passage between 2 limestone formations for about 2 miles before opening up onto the northern grazing plateau. In good weather, it was straightforward. In bad weather, it was a trap. The canyon walls channeled water from a watershed that extended 15 miles north, and it could go from dry to dangerous in the time it took to ride through it. She traced the alternate route with her finger. It ran east of the canyon through terrain that looked impassable on any official map, but wasn't if you knew where the old mining road cut through the bluffs, and if you knew about the creek crossing at the Sutter property line that was shallow enough to ford even after rain, and if you knew about the abandoned relay station at the 3-mile mark that could shelter a wagon team in an emergency. She knew all of these things. She'd discovered most of them by accident, over years, in the ordinary course of getting feed to people who needed it. She stood there looking at the map for a long moment. Then she heard the bell above the store's front door, and Teddy's voice saying, "Can I help you?" with the slightly elevated attention that meant the customer was someone he didn't recognize, and then a voice she did recognize answering unhurried, not particularly loud, the kind of voice that didn't adjust itself for the room. "Looking for Eliza Mae Carter. I was told this was her store." She folded the map, tucked it into her vest pocket, and went back out front. Colton Hayes stood just inside the door, hat in hand. He'd tied the gray horse. Outside, she could see it through the window, standing with the patience of an animal that had spent a lot of time waiting. He looked at the store the way he'd looked at the square, taking it in without performing the act of taking it in, just seeing it plainly. He looked at the sacks of feed stacked against the south wall and the shelving units that Eliza had built herself 3 years ago because the original ones had been inadequate and a carpenter would have cost money she didn't have. He looked at the ledgers on the counter and the map corner sticking out of her vest pocket. "You were thinking about it," he said. "I was looking at a map," she said. "Same thing." She studied him for a moment. He had the kind of stillness that either meant he was very calm or that he'd learned to make himself look that way, and she wasn't sure yet which it was. His jacket was worn at the elbows, and the left cuff had been resewn with thread that didn't quite match. The saddlebags she'd seen on the gray were the kind of worn that meant years, not neglect. "You said you had a delivery to make to the Alderman Ranch," she said. "I do. The Aldermans owe this store money." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile. "That a condition?" "Just a fact," she said. "I like knowing facts about people I'm considering traveling with." "Fair enough." He put his hat back on, adjusted it with 2 fingers. "I've done 3 seasons on the Northern Range. Montana, Wyoming, 1 winter in the Dakotas that I'd rather not repeat. I know how to manage a supply run in bad weather, and I know how to read terrain. I don't know the specific country around Dustmere." He looked at her steadily. "You do. I know why you're here," she said. "What I don't know is why you said what you said in the square. About you being right? About anything." She kept her voice even. "You don't know me. You rode into town an hour ago. I know you were the only person in that square looking at the sky," he said. "And I know what I saw when Hank Dooley did what he did. You didn't flinch, but you went somewhere. People who've been handling that kind of thing for years have a particular way of going somewhere without leaving. I've seen it before." He paused. "I've done it before." That landed differently than she'd expected. She'd been braced for something patronizing, some version of, "I could tell you, we're smart despite everything," or "I don't care what other people think about you," which would have been its own kind of condescension. What he'd said, instead, was something she didn't have an immediate category for. Teddy was not even pretending not to listen. He was standing at the far end of the counter with his inventory list held in front of him like a prop. "The expedition leaves tomorrow morning," she said. "That's what I heard it was. I spoke to the deputy after you left. Given the weather, I suggested delaying until the storm passes." He said the council had already committed to the timeline. Of course they did. He also said that if someone could identify a safe alternate route, he'd be willing to bring it to the council tonight. She took the map out of her vest pocket and unfolded it on the counter. He didn't move closer immediately. He waited, which she noticed. Then he came to stand beside her, not crowding, leaving space, and looked at what she'd drawn. He was quiet for a long moment, and she watched him read the map the way she watched people handle things that belonged to her, ready for carelessness, noting its absence. "This crossing here," he said, pointing to the Sutter Ford. "What's the bed like?" "Flat rock. About 8 inches deep in normal conditions. After significant rain, maybe 14, 15. Still manageable for a wagon if you take it slow and wait the rear. And this structure," he indicated the relay station. "Abandoned since the mining operation shut down. Maybe 12 years. The walls are sound. I checked them last spring when I was out that way. Roof has a gap on the east side about 2 feet wide. It's not comfortable, but it's shelter." He nodded slowly. "You checked them last spring." "I check everything I might need," she said. He looked at her then, and she felt the precise, uncomfortable sensation of being seen accurately by someone she didn't know. "I'll take this to the deputy tonight," he said. "With your permission." "It's my route," she said. "I'll take it to the deputy myself." The corner of his mouth moved. "All right." She folded the map again. "If the council agrees to the alternate route, I'll guide the first section, as far as the relay station. After that, the expedition can continue north without me." "Why only the first section?" She looked at him flatly. "Because I have a store to run." He picked up his hat from the counter where he'd set it again without her noticing. "That's one reason." She didn't ask what he thought the other reasons were. She walked him to the door and watched him go back to the gray horse, and she stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the sky, which had gotten darker while they were talking. The greenish tint was gone, replaced by something heavier and more settled. The storm had made up its mind. "Who was that?" Teddy asked from behind her. "A stranger," she said. He seemed, "Go fix the inventory list, Teddy." She went to close up the store's side window before the weather came in. And she thought about what it meant that a man she'd spoken to for 20 minutes had listened to her more carefully than most of Dustmere had in 4 years. She thought about it, and then she put it in the same mental drawer where she put most things she didn't have immediate use for. And she went back to work. The council met that evening in the back room of the saloon, which was where all of Dustmere's meaningful decisions happened, despite the existence of a perfectly functional town hall 3 buildings away. Eliza had been in this room exactly once before 2 years ago, when she'd come to dispute a licensing fee that had been applied to the feed store, but not to 2 other businesses on the same block. She'd won the dispute, which had not made her popular, and she suspected the men around this table still felt mild grievance about it. There were 8 of them, Deputy Cass, 4 members of the Cattlemen's Council, a man named Horace Bright, who owned the town's largest general store and had a financial interest in the expedition succeeding, and 2 ranchers whose names Eliza always confused because they had similar beards and the same habit of speaking only in declarative sentences. Colton Hayes was there. He'd taken a position near the wall, not at the table, which Eliza recognized as a tactical choice present, but not presumptuous, visible but not demanding. She spread her map on the table. She talked for 8 minutes. She knew it was 8 minutes because she'd paced her presentation in the store before coming, the same way she paced her conversations with the bank, knowing that every minute over her allotted attention span cost her credibility. She covered the Canyon Road's flood risk, the timeline of the incoming storm, the alternate route, its specific features, specific challenges, and what those challenges required of the riders. When she finished, Horace Bright said, "That's a long way around." "It's 4 miles longer," she said. "The Canyon Road, if it floods while you're in it, is infinitely longer." "We don't know it'll flood," said one of the bearded ranchers. "Look outside," she said. Nobody looked outside. They looked at each other, which was how these conversations always went. The information in the room was less important than the consensus of the room. And the consensus was made by men who'd been making it together for years before Eliza Carter had shown up with a map. It was Colton who spoke then, from his position near the wall. "I lost 2 men to a canyon flood in Wyoming," he said. 1,887. Identical conditions to what's coming in tonight. The trail boss knew the risk and decided the timeline was more important. He paused. "I've thought about that decision every year since." The room was quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. 4 miles longer, the deputy said finally, looking at Eliza's map. "And this ford is reliable?" "I've crossed it 11 times, she said. "The most recent was 6 weeks ago." Another silence. Horace Bright tapped his finger on the table twice, which was apparently how he indicated reluctant agreement, because the deputy nodded and said they'd take the alternate route. They did not say thank you. They moved immediately to discussing the expedition's supply manifest, and Eliza folded her map and prepared to leave, and it was only when she was almost at the door that Deputy Cass said, "You'll be coming, then, to guide the first section?" She turned around. "The first section," she said. "As far as the relay station." "Understood." She left. Outside, the first rain had started, not the main event yet, just the advance notice of it. The sky's way of saying, "Pay attention." She turned her collar up and started walking, and she'd made it half a block when Colton Hayes fell into step beside her. She didn't slow down or speed up. "They didn't thank you," he said. "They rarely do," she said. "Does that bother you?" "It used to." She kept walking. "Now I mostly just note it." He was quiet for a moment. They walked past the dry goods store, past the closed barber shop, past the alley where Eliza had once found a litter of half-drowned kittens during a bad spring storm and had carried them home in her coat and convinced her mother to keep 2 of them, which her mother had accepted with the weary grace of a woman who'd long since stopped being surprised by her eldest daughter's decisions. "You said as far as the relay station," Colton said. "Why, I told you, I have a store." Teddy seemed capable of managing a store for a few weeks. She stopped walking and turned to look at him. The rain was light enough that she could do this without being immediately uncomfortable. "You talked to Teddy? He came out while you were getting your coat. He said, and I'm quoting, 'She does this thing where she volunteers for half the thing, because she figures nobody really wants her for the whole thing.'" Eliza stared at him. She was going to have a very specific conversation with her brother tomorrow morning. "Teddy," she said carefully, "has a tendency to think he understands things he doesn't fully understand." He also said, "You've done the full route to the northern plateau twice solo in the last 2 years." She said nothing. "Which means you know the route better than anyone on this expedition," Colton said. "Which means the practical argument for coming the whole way is stronger than the argument for stopping at the relay station." "Practical argument isn't the only argument." "I know," he said. And he said it simply, without apology or pressure, just an acknowledgement that he understood there were considerations she wasn't going to explain to him in a rain-spattered street, and that was her right. She turned and started walking again. "Departure is dawn," she said, which was not agreement but was not disagreement either. "Dawn," he confirmed, and fell back to let her walk the last 2 blocks alone. She got home to find her mother awake, despite the hour, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp lit, doing the mending that her failing eyes made increasingly difficult, but that she refused to give up, because giving up things, in her view, was a habit that accelerated once you started. Her name was Rose Carter, and she was 56 years old, and she had the specific toughness of women who'd outlasted hard things without making a personality out of it. "You're wet," her mother said. "A little." Eliza hung up her coat. Council approved the alternate route. Her mother's needle went through the fabric with practiced precision despite the poor light. "And you're guiding it." "The first section." Her mother looked up. Eliza sat down across from her and poured herself a cup of coffee that had been sitting long enough to be nearly solid. She drank some of it anyway. "There's a man," her mother said. It wasn't a question. "There's a stranger who rode into town and happened to agree with my weather assessment." That's all." "Eliza Mae." "What?" Her mother set down the mending and looked at her with the expression she'd perfected when Eliza was about 12, the one that conveyed, without a single word, that she was aware of the complete truth of the situation and was simply waiting for her daughter to catch up. "I'm going to guide the alternate route because the canyon road is dangerous, and I know the terrain," Eliza said. "That's the entire reason." "Of course it is," her mother said, and picked the mending back up. Eliza drank her terrible coffee. "He listened," she said after a while. She hadn't meant to say it out loud. Her mother stitched. "When I talked about the weather, when I showed the map, he listened the same way. I listened like the information mattered, regardless of where it was coming from." "That's not nothing," her mother said quietly. "No," Eliza said. "It's not." She went to bed, eventually. She lay in the dark listening to the rain arrive in earnest, not the gentle advance notice but the real thing, heavy and purposeful, drumming on the roof, with the conviction of weather that meant business. She thought about the canyon road and what it would sound like in 6 hours, when this much water had been running through it. She thought about a man at a wall saying, "I've thought about that decision every year since." She thought about what Teddy had said, which she was furious about, and which was also, she was going to have to acknowledge this accurate. She'd been volunteering for half things for a long time. Not because she thought she was only worth half, but because she'd learned, through accumulated experience, that offering the full thing meant watching people decide they only wanted a portion anyway. And it turned out that preemptive truncation hurt less than rejection. She'd built a whole operational philosophy around that principle and called it practicality. She wasn't sure anymore that practicality and self-protection were the same thing. Dawn came gray and wet, with the storm having passed its peak sometime around 3 in the morning, and settled into the steady, determined rain of a weather system that had committed to staying. Eliza was at the square before most of the expedition party, which told her something about each of them that she filed away without judgment. There were 6 riders in total, herself, Colton, Randall Pruitt, who had apparently decided to come despite his earlier posturing, and who had not yet acknowledged Eliza's presence, by any means more direct than not running into her, a man named Pete Okafor, who worked as a hand on the Bright Ranch, and had a reputation for being useful, a woman named Dorothea Marsh, who was 40 and tough, and had been ranching the east side of the district since her husband died 7 years ago, and a young man called Skip, whose actual name might have been Skip, or might have been something else that had gotten replaced. Eliza wasn't sure. The supply wagon was loaded with winter feed, medical supplies, rope, and enough preserved food for 3 weeks. The wagon was pulled by 2 large draft horses, who looked appropriately unimpressed with the weather. Randall Pruitt said, to nobody in particular, but in a voice pitched for the whole group, "Feels wrong, taking the long way around. Feels worse drowning." Dorothea Marsh said, without looking up from checking her saddle cinch. Randall said nothing else about the route. They moved out just as the light turned from gray to pale yellow, which was as good as the sky was going to offer them. Eliza rode at the front with Colton, which had happened without discussion. He'd simply brought his horse up alongside hers, and the others had arranged themselves behind. Ahead of them, the main road north ran straight and obvious until the first fork, where Eliza turned them east onto the alternate route. The path was narrower than the canyon road and less traveled, which meant the horses had to pick through overgrown stretches in the first mile. Pete Okafor muttered something about the footing. Skip's horse shied at a branch. Randall Pruitt communicated his skepticism through a series of sighs that were probably audible in the next county. "How far to the ford?" Colton asked, keeping his voice low enough that it was just for her. "Hour and a half in this weather. Maybe 2. And after the ford, another mile to the relay station. If anyone needs a rest, that's the place." He nodded. They rode. The rain came and went in waves heavy for 10 minutes, easing to a drizzle, then building again. The terrain east of the main road was rougher than it looked, cut through with drainage gullies that Eliza navigated from memory, steering the group around two that had swollen with the overnight rain into something impassable. Each detour added time. Each detour also kept them out of water that would have made miserable and potentially dangerous crossings. They were about 40 minutes out when they heard it. It was a sound that traveled on the air before the reality it was describing arrived, a deep, continuous roar from the northwest, the kind of sound that at first your brain tries to categorize as something ordinary, wind or distant machinery, because the alternative is something you don't want to accept. Eliza stopped her horse. "That's the canyon," she said. The group pulled up behind her. Even Randall had gone quiet. The sound was water. An enormous, organized quantity of water, moving through a narrow channel very fast the canyon road, draining the overnight accumulation of a 15-mile watershed in the span of whatever this storm had added to it. They were 4 miles away, and they could hear it clearly. Pete Okafor said, very quietly, "Lord Almighty." Dorothea Marsh looked at Eliza with an expression that was not quite an apology, but was the precursor to one, the expression of someone recalibrating. Randall Pruitt looked at the sound, and then at the ground, and then at nothing in particular. Colton looked at Eliza. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel much of anything, actually, except the same alert, low-level tension that came with any bad weather, and the additional awareness that they were still a mile and a half from the relay station, and the storm hadn't finished with them yet. "We keep moving," she said. They kept moving. The ford arrived in worse condition than she'd calculated. 14 inches had been her estimate in regular rain, but the overnight storm had pushed it closer to 20, and the current was faster than she liked. She sat on her horse at the bank and looked at it for what felt like a long time, but was probably 40 seconds, reading the water the way her maps read the land, looking for the signs of the bottom, the variance in the surface that told you where the rock was solid and where it wasn't. "West side of center," she said. "The current runs lighter there. Take it slow and let the horses feel their way. Don't push them." "You sure?" Randall asked. She didn't answer him. She put her horse into the water. The crossing took 11 minutes, which was long enough for everyone to be soaked, and short enough that nobody panicked, and fast enough that no horse went down. The draft horses on the supply wagon were the worst of it. The wagon lurched twice, and Pete Okafor ended up in the water to his knees, pushing the rear wheel free from a soft patch, but they made it across, and on the other bank Eliza counted heads and found 6, same as she'd started with. Skip was laughing, not at anything specific, just the released energy of having been scared, and coming out the other side intact. That was he started. "Don't," Dorothea told him, but not unkindly. They reached the relay station an hour later, and Eliza pulled up in front of it and looked at it, with the particular satisfaction of something she'd scouted and maintained in her mental inventory for 2 years, finally being actually needed. The walls were exactly as she'd left them last spring, solid limestone, 3 feet thick, proof against any wind this storm could produce. The roof gap on the east side was letting in rain, but only onto a 4-foot square of dirt floor that nobody needed to occupy. The group dismounted and got the horses under the overhang, and the wagon parked at an angle that blocked most of the wind. Dorothea Marsh came to stand beside Eliza while the others were seeing to the horses. "I owe you an apology," Dorothea said. She said it the same way she said everything else, flat, direct, without embellishment. I didn't speak up in the square when I should have. You didn't laugh, Eliza said. That's a low bar. Yes, Eliza agreed. But it's the bar most people didn't clear. Dorothea looked at the relay station's interior, where Skip was attempting to start a fire with wet wood, and Pete was helping with the competence of someone who'd done it before. You going to stop here? Dorothea asked. Or finish the route? Eliza looked at the map in her vest pocket. She looked at the sky, which was still heavy but differently heavy than it had been, the kind of heavy that was winding down rather than building up. She thought about half things. I'll ride the full route, she said. She said it quietly, without announcement, and Dorothea Marsh nodded once and went to help with the fire. From across the shelter, Colton Hayes looked at Eliza without making a thing of it, the way he did most things, and she didn't acknowledge it, and he didn't require her to. They ate a brief, damp meal and rested the horses for an hour, and when the rain eased to a drizzle that the northwest wind was already beginning to pull apart, Eliza stood up and said they should move. She led them out of the relay station, up the bluff road, through the mining cut that opened onto the northern plateau, like a door someone had left unlocked, and by the time the Alderman Ranch was visible in the distance, a dark smudge on the gray-green horizon. The sky to the east had begun the tentative lightening that might, in another hour, become actual sun. She was still thinking about Teddy and what she was going to say to him when she got back. She was also thinking that the northern plateau was more beautiful than she remembered, and that the last time she'd been out this way, she'd been alone, and that traveling alone had specific advantages and specific costs, and she'd been paying those costs for long enough that she'd stopped noticing them. The gray horse came up on her left Colton, settling in without ceremony. Neither of them said anything for a while. Full route, he said eventually. Full route, she confirmed. They rode toward the Alderman Ranch with the sky lightening around them, and the plateau opening up ahead, and behind them the relay station sat solid on its bluff. And further behind that, somewhere they could no longer hear, Canyon Road was doing exactly what Eliza had said it would do. The Alderman Ranch was not what Eliza had expected, which was itself a lesson she kept having to relearn, that the places she'd supplied for years looked different from the inside than they did from a delivery route. From the outside, the Alderman operation was simply a destination, the end point of a long ride, a signature on a receipt, a number in a ledger that was either paid or wasn't. From the inside, standing in the main yard while the horses were watered, and the wagon was checked for damage from the ford crossing, she could see that it was a working ranch in the specific, unglamorous way of operations that had survived several bad years in a row. The fences were maintained but not improved. The barn had been repaired in sections, each section a slightly different color of weathered wood. The hands who came out to help unload the supply wagon moved with the efficiency of people who didn't waste energy because they didn't have energy to waste. Vernon Alderman met them in the yard. He was 60-something, thick through the chest, with the particular leather-faced quality of men who'd spent decades outdoors without making any concessions to it. He looked at the supply wagon first, which was appropriate, and then at the group, which was when his eyes found Eliza. Carter's girl, he said. Carter's, she confirmed, keeping her voice neutral. She'd been Carter's girl to Vernon Alderman for 4 years. Stopped correcting it. Heard you came the east way, he said. Canyon Road flooded. He looked northwest, toward where the canyon was, though it wasn't visible from the ranch. Yeah, he said. I heard that last night. That roar. He looked back at her. Smart call. She waited for the rest of it, the qualifier, the reluctant addition, the but that usually followed a compliment offered to her by a man of Vernon Alderman's generation. It didn't come. He just nodded and went to supervise the unloading, and she was left briefly unbalanced by the absence of the thing she'd been bracing for. They stayed at the Alderman Ranch for the night. Storm's aftermath had made the plateau roads uncertain enough that riding on toward the next delivery point in the remaining daylight wasn't practical. And Vernon, whatever his failings as a prompt bill payer, extended hospitality the way frontier ranchers tended to, not warmly, exactly, but completely, with enough food and a dry place to sleep and no questions about how long anyone needed. Eliza slept in the ranch's spare room, which was used as a tax storage space when it wasn't housing guests, and she lay on the narrow cot with her maps spread on the floor beside her, and the lamp turned low, going over the next section of the route in her head. The plateau road to the McCready Ranch was straightforward. Or it had been the last time she'd ridden it, 8 months ago. 8 months was enough time for a lot of things to change. She made a mental note of the areas that were most likely to have been affected by the storm. She was thinking about the section between the Second Creek and the Ridge Line when she heard footsteps in the hall outside, unhurried, and then they stopped at her door, and there was a pause, and then Colton's voice, quiet. "You awake?" "Yes. Alderman just told me something. About the water rights." She sat up. "Come in." He opened the door and leaned against the frame, not entering, which she registered as a courtesy. He'd taken off his jacket and his shirt was rolled to the elbows, and he had the look of someone who'd washed off the day's travel but was still carrying some of it in his expression. He said the canyon road flooding wasn't just the storm, Colton said. She waited. He said there's been talk among the northern ranchers for about 6 months. The Greer family, you know them? She knew them. Silas Greer and his 2 sons, who held the largest land claim on the western side of the district. She'd delivered to them twice, early on, and then they'd switched to sourcing their feed from a supplier in the next county, which she'd always assumed was a price decision. "I know of them," she said. "Alderman says the Greers have been making adjustments to the water diversion channels on their property. Legal. On paper, they have the water rights to their section of the watershed. But the adjustments have been pushing more water into the canyon drainage." He paused. Apparently, this isn't the first time the canyon road has shown stress in a storm. It's the 3rd time in 18 months. Each time, aldermen and the other northern ranchers have been cut off from the supply route for days. She was quiet for a moment, fitting this new information against what she already knew. And each time, she said slowly, the ranchers who can't get supply deliveries have to source from elsewhere. At higher prices, Colton said. From suppliers the Greers happen to have relationships with. The thing about this kind of information was that it didn't arrive with drama. It arrived quietly, like water finding a low point, and then you looked back at everything that had seemed simply unfortunate and saw the shape of it differently. She thought about Vernon Alderman's ledger account, the late payments she'd always attributed to cash flow, the pattern of which months were hardest. She thought about the other northern ranchers who owed Carter's money. "Does he have proof?" she asked. "Not the kind that means anything in a council meeting. He has observation and he has inference, and he has the collective frustration of 6 ranchers who've been losing money to a supply problem that seems to keep finding them in specific weather conditions." "That's not enough," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not." He pushed off the door frame. "I thought you should know, given that you know this country and these accounts better than anyone. Because I might see something in it that you don't," she said. "Because you've been looking at the whole picture from a different angle than anyone else," he said, "for a long time." He said goodnight and pulled the door mostly shut, and she sat in the low lamplight and looked at her maps on the floor and thought about the Greer family's land and where their diversion channels would be positioned, and what 4 years of Carter's delivery records might show if you looked at them, through the lens of what Alderman had just described. She thought about it for a long time before she slept. The next morning was cold and clear, the plateau washed clean by the storm and glittering under a sky that had the particular intensity of blue that only appeared after sustained rain had scoured everything. Eliza had been up before the rest of the group and had already checked both horses and walked the first quarter-mile of the morning's route before the others emerged from the ranch house. Colton found her at the edge of the yard looking north. "McCready Ranch is 14 miles, she said, without turning around. She'd heard the gray horse's particular footfall, which had a slight asymmetry the left front, just barely heavier than the right. Probably an old stone bruise that had mostly healed. "Winds dropped," he said. "It'll come back by afternoon. Northwest again, same pattern." She turned. "How's your horse's left front?" He looked at her with an expression she'd started to recognize, the slight recalibration that happened when she knew something he hadn't told her. "Old injury," he said. "Mostly sound. Keep him on the left side of the path on the ridge section. The ground runs softer there." She went back to the yard to organize the group, and she heard him standing there for a moment before he followed. They left the Alderman Ranch at 7 and made reasonable time to the first waypoint, a small water station that the northern ranchers maintained collectively, or had maintained before 6 months of supply disruption, had let it fall into partial disrepair. Pump needed work. Pete Okafor, who turned out to have a mechanical competence that hadn't been apparent until it was needed, spent 20 minutes on it with a wrench from the wagon's toolkit, while the rest of them rested the horses. Randall Pruitt had been, since the Ford crossing, a different version of himself. He hadn't apologized. He probably wasn't going to apologize. Eliza had known enough Randall Pruitts in her life to understand that direct acknowledgement of error was not generally in the repertoire. But he'd stopped sighing, and he'd helped with the wagon at the Ford without being asked. And when Eliza made route calls, he listened with his mouth shut. That was, for Randall Pruitt, a significant behavioral adjustment, and she recognized it for what it was without requiring it to be more. They reached the ridge section at mid-morning. The ridge road was the part of the route that Eliza had been least certain about, not because she didn't know it, but because it was the section most likely to have been affected by the storm. It ran along the eastern face of a limestone bluff for about a mile, and the road itself was cut into the hillside, with the bluff above and a significant drop to the right. In good conditions, it was navigable but required attention. After the kind of rain they'd had, she'd been prepared for anything from minor erosion to complete loss of the road surface. What she found was somewhere in between. The road existed, but it had narrowed. A section of the bluff had shed a layer of limestone, not a full rock slide, just a skin of it, the kind that happened when water got into the fault lines. The debris had pushed the effective road width down to perhaps 6 feet in one stretch of about 30 yards, with loose material on the upper side and the drop on the lower. She stopped the group at the beginning of the narrow section and got off her horse. She walked the 30 yards first, on foot, testing the surface, checking where the debris was stable and where it wasn't. The ground was damp, and the loose rock shifted under her boots in a way she didn't love but could work with. The key would be keeping the horses calm and moving steadily. Panic in a narrow section with a drop on one side would be catastrophic. She came back to the group. "Single file," she said. "Give the horse ahead of you 30 feet minimum. Don't rush and don't stop. If a horse hesitates, speak to it quietly. Don't kick, don't jerk the reins. The surface is manageable if you don't make sudden movements." She paused. "The wagon is the concern. Pete, you'll need to walk the draft horses through. I'll take the left side, you take the right." Pete Okafor nodded. "Questions?" she asked. Skip raised his hand halfway, then lowered it, then said, "What if a horse actually goes down?" "Don't let them," she said. She went first, leading her own horse by the reins, talking to it low and steady in the tone she used for animals that were uncertain, not soothing exactly. Just a constant, grounded presence, a voice that said, "I'm here and I know where we're going, and you can trust the next step." The horse's ears were flat, and then they weren't, and its hooves found the surface with the careful deliberation of an animal doing its best. 30 yards had never felt longer. She reached the other side and turned. Behind her, Colton came through with the gray, and then Dorothea, and then Randall, and then Skip, who closed his eyes for about half the traverse in a way that should probably have made things worse, but apparently didn't. The wagon was the last thing, and it was the hardest thing. Pete Okafor on the right side and Eliza on the left, both of them walking the draft horses through, and the wagon wheels finding every irregularity in the debris with the enthusiasm of something that had no interest in making this easy. The left rear wheel found a soft patch and sank 2 inches, and Eliza put her shoulder against the side panel and pushed without thinking about whether this was a good idea, and the wheel came free, and they kept moving, and when the wagon reached the solid road on the other side, everyone who'd been holding their breath released it at approximately the same time. Pete Okafor looked at his hands, which were shaking slightly, and put them in his pockets. "Good," Eliza said, and meant it. They ate a brief lunch in the shelter of a rock formation an hour past the ridge. Eliza sat slightly apart from the group with her maps and the mental notes she'd been accumulating, and she was thinking about the Greer water channels when she became aware that Dorothea Marsh had settled nearby. "You've been somewhere else since last night," Dorothea said. "I'm here," Eliza said. "Physically," Dorothea said. "What did Hayes tell you?" Eliza looked at her. Dorothea had the kind of perceptiveness that came from decades of managing a ranch solo, the ability to read a situation from its edges rather than its center, because the center was usually where the noise was, and the edges were where the information was. "Something about the water situation," Eliza said. She told Dorothea what Alderman had told Colton. She told it precisely, without editorializing, the same way she kept accounts, what was known, what was inferred, what was unproven. When she finished, Dorothea sat for a long moment. The wind was coming back from the northwest, as Eliza had predicted, moving through the rock formation with a low sound. The Greers, Dorothea said. Silas Greer. He came to me 2 years ago. He wanted to buy the East Range. You said no. I said no. He said I'd regret it. She paused. My supply costs went up 40% the next season. Couldn't prove a connection. Eliza filed this. Another rancher. Another pattern she'd been looking at as individual bad luck. That might be something else entirely. We'll need records, she said. More than what Alderman has. You've been delivering to most of these ranches for 4 years, Dorothea said. Yes, Eliza said. And she'd kept the records. Every delivery, every payment date, every late payment, annotated with the circumstances as she'd understood them at the time. 4 years of data sitting in the back room of Carter's feed and dry goods, in the same careful handwriting that had failed to impress Gerald Fitch at the bank. She hadn't known what she had. She'd just kept it because keeping records was the way she operated. She stood up and put the maps back in her pocket. Let's keep moving, she said. They reached the McCready Ranch at mid-afternoon, completed the second delivery, rested for an hour, and pushed on toward the third waypoint before the light failed. Storm's aftermath had made the terrain unpredictable in specific ways. Roads that should have been clear had debris, drainage gullies had changed course. A low section near the third waypoint was flooded enough to require another detour. Each deviation Eliza navigated without significant delay, because she'd been doing this kind of problem-solving on these roads for 4 years, and it had built in her a kind of adaptive fluency, not that she knew every answer, but that she knew how to find them. By the time they made camp on the second night, the group had shifted in ways that were visible if you knew what to look for. Skip, who'd been peripheral and uncertain on the first morning, was now doing camp tasks without being directed, picking up on what needed doing and doing it, which was how people became useful not through assignment, but through paying attention. Pete Okafor had settled into a comfortable competence alongside Eliza's navigation, the two of them forming an informal, technical partnership around what the terrain required. Dorothea moved through the camp with the authority of a rancher on her own land, which she carried everywhere she went. Randall Pruitt helped with the fire without being asked. It was a small thing. She wasn't going to make it larger than it was. The third morning was when things went wrong. Not all at once, that was never how it happened, in Eliza's experience. Things went wrong incrementally, each step leading to the next, with the logic of a problem that had been building before you arrived at it. The first sign was the weather, which had shifted again overnight in a way she hadn't anticipated. The northwest wind had backed around to the south, and the temperature had dropped. And there was a specific quality to the air that she recognized from her worst supply run, the winter of 2 years ago, when she'd been caught solo in a 3-day freeze, as the precursor to something more sustained and more serious than what they'd already been through. The second science was the canyon. They weren't near the main canyon, they were on the eastern route, 2 miles from it, but canyons in this country connected to each other through a system of subsidiary drainages that weren't always visible on maps and weren't visible at all unless you knew to look for them. She'd known, abstractly, that their third-day route passed near one of these subsidiary channels. She hadn't known, because she'd never ridden this specific section in a storm's aftermath, that the overnight drop in temperature, combined with the previous day's saturation of the ground, would produce what she now saw ahead of them. Water coming not from above, but from the ground itself, pushed up from the saturated substrate, sheeting across the path in a broad, shallow flow that was getting less shallow as she watched. Stopped the group. That wasn't there yesterday, Colton said. No, she agreed. It's groundwater. The storm saturated the substrate, and now it's expressing. She looked at the flow maybe 40 yards wide, moving with the deceptive ease of water that didn't look fast because it was shallow, but was covering a lot of ground. She looked at the canyon walls to the left, which channeled the subsidiary drainage. She looked at the sky. How long has it been doing this? Randall asked. Since sometime this morning, probably. She did the calculation. The substrate had been expressing since dawn, and it was now mid-morning, and the flow rate was what she was observing. It's going to get worse before it gets better. Can we go around? Skip asked. She looked at the terrain to the right. The detour would add 3 miles, loop them close to the main canyon drainage, and require crossing ground that was almost certainly as saturated as what they were looking at. Maybe, she said. I need to look at it. She rode ahead alone, pushing her horse faster than was comfortable in the wet conditions, doing a fast survey of the right-hand terrain. What she found was not encouraging. The ground to the right was holding for now, but had the spongy quality of a landscape that was at its limit one more significant water input, and it would start expressing the same way. And the sky to the southwest had the color that she'd learned, over 4 years of watching it, meant that input was coming. She came back to the group. The right detour is possible, but it'll put us in trouble if the weather shifts before we clear it, she said. The timing is too close. She looked at the flow ahead of them. Straight through is faster, but the water's rising. We need to move now before it gets worse. How much worse can it get? Randall asked. A lot, she said. And she said it flatly, without drama, because flat statements about serious things had always struck her as more honest than the kind of urgency that performed itself. They went straight through. The horses didn't like it. Draft horses on the wagon liked it least. Their feet found the bottom of the flow with a sucking reluctance, and the wagon wheels created their own small bow waves in the sheeting water, and for a long moment in the middle of the crossing, Eliza was not sure the rear axle was going to clear the soft section she could see developing on the downstream side of their track. It cleared, by perhaps 2 inches. On the other side, Skip counted heads again, which had apparently become his contribution to group security. 6, he said. All 6. Good, Eliza said, and turned north, and then she heard the sound. She'd heard a version of it yesterday morning, the low, organized roar from the canyon. This was different. This was closer, and it had a different frequency, lower and less continuous, more like something intermittent and massive, rather than a sustained flow. Like the earth itself was shifting weight. She stopped. Colton stopped beside her. That's not water, he said. No, she said. That's rock. They were close enough to the subsidiary canyon, now that she could see its near wall, a limestone formation maybe 60 feet high, striped with the dark staining of water that had been running through its faults for decades. And while she watched, a section of the upper face moved. Not much, not dramatically. Just a slow, grinding shift that released a curtain of debris down the wall face, followed by a sound like something very old finally giving up on holding itself together. Rock's going to come, Colton said. It's going to come, she agreed. Behind them, the groundwater flow they'd crossed was still rising. To their right, the saturated ground. To their left, a 60-foot limestone wall that was in the process of losing its structural argument with gravity. Ahead, the path continued north, and at the next quarter mile, she knew this from her maps. From the scouting she'd done over 4 years, the path ran directly beneath an overhang of that same limestone formation. She made the calculation fast, the way she made all her calculations, not because she was fearless, but because the situation didn't have room for anything slower than fast. Off the path, she said now. Right side uphill as far as you can get. She didn't wait for questions or agreement. She turned her horse and pushed it up the right-hand slope into the saturated but still firm ground of the higher terrain. And she heard the group moving behind her, and she heard the limestone wall making more of its grinding, giving up sounds. And she did not look at it yet, because looking at it wasn't going to change anything about the next 30 seconds. They'd gotten perhaps 40 feet off the path when the overhang came down. It didn't fall all at once, it came in 2 stages. The first, a fracture that ran along the upper fault line, with a crack that hit the air like a gunshot, and the second, the actual collapse, which was slower than you'd expect. The limestone rotating outward and downward, with a terrible deliberateness, trailing dust and smaller debris, and it hit the path they'd been riding with a sound that Eliza felt in her sternum, rather than heard with her ears. The horses panicked. All of them. Simultaneously, in their different ways, Skip's horse reared. Pete's gelding spun. Colton's gray went sideways, and nearly took Colton off its back before he brought it down with his weight and his voice, and Eliza's horse tried to bolt uphill, which was the instinct she'd been counting on, because uphill was where she wanted to be, so she let it run for 20 feet and then brought it back. When the dust settled and it took longer than she expected, the path below them was gone. Not damaged, not partially blocked. Gone. buried under 6 feet of limestone debris for a stretch of about 40 yards. They were above it. All 6 of them. Randall Pruitt's face had gone the color of old paper. Gip had his eyes open this time, very wide, taking in what had just happened with the particular expression of someone whose understanding of what a bad day could look like had been substantially revised. Dorothea Marsh sat on her horse with her hands steady on the reins and said nothing, but her jaw was tight in a way that said everything she wasn't saying. Pete Okafor looked at the debris field below and then at Eliza. "You knew," he said. "Not accusatory, just identifying a fact." "I knew it was possible," she said. "I didn't know the timing." "Close enough," he said. Colton brought the gray alongside her. The horse was still breathing fast, its flanks working, but it was controlled. He looked at the path below, at what 40 yards of collapsed limestone meant for their route. "We can't go back," he said. "The groundwater crossing. It'll be impassable by now," she said. She'd been watching the flow when they'd crossed it. Even then, it had been at the edge of what was manageable. With the additional time that had passed, no. "And we can't go forward on the path." "No." She looked at the terrain they were standing on. The high right side slope saturated, uncertain, but still holding. It ran roughly parallel to the path, for she measured it in her memory, laying her mental map over the physical reality, maybe a quarter mile before the canyon wall curved west and the high ground ended. But before it ended, there was something else. She was almost certain there was something else. She pulled out her map. The annotation she was looking for was in the margin, written in the cramped shorthand she used when she was writing notes, while cold or tired, old mine access E-face, not surveyed. She'd made that note 14 months ago, on a delivery run, when she'd noticed an opening in the canyon's eastern face from the path below, but hadn't had time to investigate. An opening in the canyon's eastern face, which, if it went through and old mine tunnels in this district generally went through, because they'd been dug to access ore deposits that ran east-west through the limestone, would come out on the eastern side of the canyon wall, above the debris field, on navigable ground. If it went through. "There's something here," she said. She showed Colton the map annotation. "I've never been inside it. I can't tell you what's in there." He looked at the annotation. He looked at the terrain around them. He looked at the sky, which was doing the thing she'd predicted, the southwestern weather moving in, the light going flat and gray. "How confident are you," he said, "that it exists?" "Fairly." "That it goes through?" She paused. "It was dug to access ore. The ore seam runs east. That's the logic, not the certainty. What's the alternative?" She looked at the high slope, the saturated ground, the closing weather, the debris field below. She thought about the timing of the weather and the rate at which the slope would lose its integrity, and what 6 people and a supply wagon weighed against that equation. "This," she said. "This is the alternative." He nodded once. "Show me where it is," he said. She rode east along the high slope, the group following, and she found the canyon's eastern face, and she found the opening exactly where her note had put it, a dark rectangle cut into the limestone. Approximately 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, partially obscured by the growth of 14 months and the debris of last night's rain. It was real. The first part was real. She got off her horse and stood at the entrance and looked in, and the dark was complete past about 10 feet, and beyond that there was nothing she could determine without going in. "I need a lamp," she said. Pete Okafor had one in the wagon kit. He got it lit, which took 3 attempts, because his hands were still slightly unsteady, and Eliza took it and walked into the tunnel. The first thing she noticed was that it smelled like deep earth, not rot, not stagnation, just the cold mineral smell of rock that had been closed away from the air for a long time. The second thing she noticed was that the walls were cut. Not natural, she could see the marks of tools in the limestone, old and regular, the work of men who'd known what they were doing. The third thing was the sound. From somewhere ahead of her, she couldn't judge the distance. In the dark, there was a sound of moving air. Not a draft exactly, but the pressure differential of a space connected to outside air. A tunnel that connected to outside air at both ends. It went through. She stood there for a moment, with the lamp and the smell of old rock and the sound of distant air movement, and she felt something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite triumph, something closer to the satisfaction of a calculation that had resolved correctly, colored by the awareness that it needed to resolve correctly, because the alternative was a slope that wasn't going to hold through the incoming weather, with 6 people and a supply wagon on it. She went back to the entrance. "It connects," she said. "I can hear air moving through." Colton looked at her. "How wide does it stay?" he asked. "I don't know. Is there room for the wagon?" "I don't know that either." She looked at the entrance dimensions, then at the wagon. "It'll be close. We'll need to check as we go, and if it narrows, then we leave the wagon and come back for it." She said it plainly, because the plainest version of a difficult option was usually the most useful one. The horses and the people are what matter. He nodded. He looked at the group behind him, Skip with his wide, frightened eyes, Pete with his contained steadiness, Dorothea with her jaw still tight, Randall with his paper-white face that had not yet regained its color. "All right," Colton said. "How do you want to handle this?" She'd been thinking about that since she'd come out of the tunnel. "I go first with the lamp," she said. "You bring the gray behind me. If the gray goes, the other horses will follow. He's the calmest of the riding horses, and they've been taking cues from him since the ridge section. Pete, you and I will guide the draft horses once we know the width is sufficient. Dorothea, I need you behind the wagon, watching the rear. Skip, Randall, stay with the riding horses and keep them calm and moving." Nobody argued. 3 days ago, Randall Pruitt would have argued. Today he just said, understood, and meant it. She picked up the lamp and walked back into the tunnel. Behind her, she heard the sound of horses entering stone. The particular change in acoustic quality when the outdoors became indoors, and then the sound of the group settling into the specific careful movement of people and animals navigating darkness together. She kept the lamp steady and walked. The tunnel was 6 feet high for the first 30 yards, then dropped to 5.5 for a section that made Colton duck his head on horseback, then opened back to 6. The width held at 4.5 to 5 feet tight for the wagon, but not impossible. She found out it was not impossible because she made Pete Okafor bring the wagon to the narrowest point, and they measured it by hand in the lamplight before they committed to bringing it through, and the wagon cleared by perhaps 4 inches on each side. 4 inches was enough. They were perhaps 300 yards into the tunnel when the ceiling shifted. Not catastrophically. Not the way the overhang had shifted outside. This was smaller. A single section of the ceiling, shedding a layer of debris the size of a tabletop, dropping it into the middle of the tunnel with a crash that in the enclosed space sounded like a cannon shot. The horses reacted immediately, controlled panic, contained by the tunnel walls, which was a mercy and a terror simultaneously, because the walls kept them from bolting and also left them nowhere to go. Eliza's horse went to its knees. She was off its back before it completed the movement, landing on her feet, keeping hold of the reins, keeping the lamp somehow level, talking to the horse in the constant low tone that she used for this kind of emergency, not words exactly. Just sound, just the assurance that there was a human nearby who was not also panicking. Behind her, Colton's voice, doing the same thing. And Pete's, and then Dorothea's. Skip's horse had reared in the confined space, and Skip had gone sideways. And for a terrible moment, all Eliza could hear from that direction was hooves on stone, and the particular sound of a person trying to get clear of a panicking animal in a space that didn't offer getting clear. Then she heard Colton's voice, close and sharp, and the sound changed the horse coming down. Colton's gray, apparently near enough to communicate something, through the darkness that human voices couldn't. "Skip," Eliza called. "I'm a pause. I'm here. I'm okay. I think. Are you hurt?" Another pause. The pause of someone doing a quick inventory of their body. "My shoulder." Not "I don't think it." Stay still for a moment. She got her horse to its feet, speaking to it continuously, checking its legs by feel in the lamplight, a scrape on the left front. Nothing structural. She moved down the group, lamp held high, checking each animal and each person in the orange circle of light. Pete's gelding had a cut above the eye from where it had hit the tunnel wall. Randall's horse was trembling but sound. The draft horses had planted their feet and simply refused to move, which was frightening and also the safest thing they could have done. Skip was on his feet. His shoulder was already swelling at the joint. Not dislocated, she thought, but badly jarred. He was holding it with his other hand, and his face was pale, but his eyes were focused. "I can ride," he said. "You don't have to decide that yet," she said. Colton came back along the group to her. In the lamplight, his face was dirty, and there was a gash on his left forearm that he wasn't mentioning. Your arm, she said. He looked at it. It's fine. It's bleeding. It's fine, he said again, with the specific male stubbornness about injury that she'd observed often enough to know she wasn't going to resolve in a tunnel. How far to the exit? She'd been measuring in her head approximately from the moment they'd entered. I think another 150 yards, maybe 200. The ceiling's going to keep coming down. Probably, she said. The storm's added pressure to the whole formation. The mining era shoring is old. Then we move fast. We move carefully, she said. Fast in a narrow tunnel with spooked horses is how people get killed. He looked at her. Carefully, he said, but not slow. Not slow, she agreed. She took a breath. She looked down the tunnel at the dark ahead of her, the lamplight reaching maybe 20 feet before it gave up. 200 yards. Probably 200 yards. She adjusted her grip on the reins and the lamp and started walking. Behind her, the group moved not smoothly, not confidently, but together. The draft horses came off their planted feet after Pete spent 3 minutes on them with his voice and his patience. Gip rode with his good arm on the reins and his injured shoulder held carefully still, which was either brave or stubborn, and was probably both. The ceiling came down in 2 more places smaller each time, debris rather than collapse, the stone announcing its instability without committing to it fully. Each time, Eliza kept moving, kept her voice level, kept the lamp steady, and the group followed the lamp because the lamp was the only thing that knew where it was going. And then, ahead of her, in the dark, something changed. Quality of the air changed first, the pressure differential she'd felt at the entrance. Stronger now, the feeling of outside coming to meet them. Then the dark changed, not dramatically, not the sudden bright daylight of stories that resolved themselves cleanly, but a gradual shift from absolute black to the deep gray that meant the end of enclosed space. She walked toward it. The exit was smaller than the entrance, 4 feet high, requiring everyone to dismount and lead the horses through in a crouch that was awkward and undignified and completely irrelevant. She went through first, straightening up on the other side, and the gray sky above her was the best thing she'd seen in 3 days. She stood there in the cold air and took 2 breaths. Then she turned and helped guide the first horse through, and then the second, and then the wagon, which required removing one of the sideboards to clear the reduced opening, and then Skip, who came through one-armed and managed not to fall, and then Randall, who came through and stood up and looked around at the open ground and the gray sky and the canyon wall behind them and said nothing at all, which from Randall was as close to speechlessness as Eliza had seen from him. Counted. 6 people. 6 horses. 1 wagon minus a sideboard that Pete had set just inside the tunnel mouth and retrieved after. She turned to look at where they were. They were on the eastern side of the canyon wall, above the debris field, on solid ground that ran north toward the plateau. The supply route continued 2 miles ahead, but something else registered, past the relief of being out and the instinct to keep moving north. She was standing above a section of terrain she'd never seen from this angle before, and from here, from the height of the tunnel set on the canyon's eastern face, she could see something she hadn't been able to see from the path below. To the west, across the canyon, on the Greer family's land, there was a structure, not a building. A water installation, a series of channels and diversion gates, clearly engineered, clearly deliberate, positioned at exactly the points where a person who understood watershed management would position them to push water into the canyon's main drainage. It was built to do what Alderman had described. And from the path below, from any normal vantage point on the supply route, it was invisible. From here, it was completely obvious. She stood there looking at it for a long moment. She thought about Vernon Alderman's unpaid invoices. She thought about Dorothea Marsh's 40% cost increase. She thought about the canyon road flooding 3 times in 18 months, and the northern ranchers being cut off, and the suppliers who'd benefited from their desperation. She thought about her 4 years of records, sitting in the back room of Carter's feed and dry goods. Colton came to stand beside her. He looked where she was looking. "That's what I think it is," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. They stood there another moment, the 2 of them, while the group rested behind them, and the gray sky moved overhead. "We finish the delivery run," she said, "and then we go home." "And then?" he said. She looked at the Greer installation one more time, fixing its position in her memory with the same precision she applied to everything she needed to keep. And then she said, "I have some records to look at." They finished the delivery run in 4 days. 4 days of wet ground and uncertain roads, and the particular exhaustion that comes from sustained alertness, the kind where you never fully relax because the terrain won't let you, where every mile requires a decision and every decision has consequence. Skip's shoulder stiffened badly on the 3rd day, and Pete Okafor rigged him a sling from wagon canvas that was ugly and functional, and exactly what the situation called for. The missing sideboard on the wagon was replaced at the last delivery point by a rancher named Galt who had spare lumber and no interest in explanations, just the practical frontier hospitality of someone who saw a need and addressed it without ceremony. The last delivery was to a small operation at the northern edge of the plateau run by a widow named Clara Foss, who was 63 and had been ranching alone since her husband drowned in a spring flood 9 years earlier. She took the feed delivery with the same efficiency she probably applied to everything, checking the weight, signing the receipt, directing her single hired hand on where to store the sacks, and then she invited the group inside for coffee, and she sat across from Eliza at her kitchen table and said, without preamble, "You're Carter's daughter, the one who runs the store now." "Yes," Eliza said. "Your father extended us credit 3 winters running when we needed it." Clara Foss wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I never got to tell him that meant the difference." Eliza didn't say anything for a moment. She knew the Foss account. She knew every account. She knew which ones her father had carried past the point of strict business sense, because the people behind them were in genuine trouble, and she'd maintained the same practice when she took over, because it was right, and also because it was how her father had built the relationships that kept the store alive. Nobody had ever told her it had meant the difference. She said, "I'll tell him." Clara Foss nodded and refilled her coffee without being asked. The ride back to Dustmere took 2 days. Storm system had moved fully east, leaving the sky that particular clean after rain-sharp-edged clouds. Strong light, the kind of visibility that made the landscape look like someone had adjusted something fundamental about the air itself. On the first day back, Eliza rode mostly in silence, letting the group's conversation happen around her, while she worked through what she'd been assembling in her head since she'd stood above the canyon and seen the Greer installation. The records she was thinking about were in 4 ledgers, 2 account books, and a collection of loose delivery receipts she'd filed by date in a wooden box under the backroom workbench. They covered every transaction Carter's feed and dry goods had made with the northern ranches over 4 years. They showed payment dates, delivery dates, the notations she'd made about road conditions and access problems. They showed, if you knew what you were looking at, a pattern, the specific clustering of late payments and supply disruptions that corresponded, each time, with conditions on the canyon road. She'd been looking at those records as accounts, as numbers that needed to balance. She hadn't been looking at them as evidence. That distinction was going to matter. On the 2nd day, about 6 miles out from Dustmere, Colton brought the gray up alongside her in the easy way he'd had since the plateau, not announcing himself, just arriving, as if the space beside her was somewhere always been heading. "You've been thinking about the Greer installation since we came out of the tunnel," he said. "I've been thinking about the records," she said. "The installation is what it is. What matters is whether I can show cause and effect that the diversions produced specific demonstrable harm to specific people over a documented period. Can you?" "I think so." She'd been running the numbers in her head for 2 days, and they were aligning in ways that felt solid. The timing of the disruptions corresponds to the Greer water rights modifications that Alderman mentioned, and the payment pattern of the affected ranches shows a consistent deterioration starting about 18 months ago, which tracks with when the modifications would have been operational. "That's circumstantial." "Most things are at first," she said. Circumstantial that covers 4 years and 6 ranches and holds up to arithmetic is a different kind of circumstantial than a story one man tells about another man. It was quiet for a moment. The road ahead curved gently south, and Dustmere's water tower was visible in the distance, the first sign of the town, always the first. "Who do you take it to?" he said. She'd thought about this, too. The Cattlemen's Council was the obvious answer, and also the wrong one. Horace Bright sat on the council. And Horace Bright had financial relationships that Eliza had never fully mapped but suspected were more entangled with the Greer family supply arrangements than was comfortable. The deputy was a decent man and a limited one. The county seat was 50 miles away and had a circuit judge who came through 4 times a year. "I don't know yet," she said, which was honest. "First I look at the records. Then I know what I have. Then I decide who can do something with it." He nodded. "I want to help," he said. She looked at him. She'd been waiting for something like this, for the offer that had a condition attached. The help that came with a cost she hadn't agreed to pay. She'd learned to wait for it, with most people. It almost always came. "Why?" she said. He thought about it, which she respected the fact that he didn't answer immediately, that he took the question seriously, instead of deflecting it with something easy. "Because what's being done to those ranchers is wrong," he said. "And because I've spent enough years riding through country where wrong things happened that nobody did anything about because fixing them was inconvenient." He paused. "And because you're going to do this whether anyone helps you or not, and doing it alone is harder and slower, and the Greer family is not going to simply agree that you found them out." She rode for a moment. "The alderman debt," she said. "He owes Carter's $60. I know. If he cooperates with what I'm building, gives me his records, his account of the modifications, I'm prepared to restructure that debt. That's between you and Alderman. I'm telling you because you'll be there when I talk to him, and I want you to understand that my reasons aren't purely principled. Good business as well as right." Something in his expression shifted toward something. She didn't have a word for not admiration exactly, more like recognition. "All right," he said. They rode the last 6 miles without needing to fill the silence. Duskmere looked the same as it always did on the approach from the north, the water tower. Then the church steeple. Then the roofline of the main buildings coming up as the road descended into the basin the town occupied. But knowing a place was the same wasn't the same as feeling it, and Eliza felt something different this time coming in, not arrival exactly. More like return with revised information. The particular sensation of coming back to a familiar room and seeing it with the knowledge of what was hidden in its walls. The rescue party met them half a mile out. She hadn't expected a rescue party. She probably should have 6 riders missing for 2 additional days past the planned timeline, last known position in terrain that had experienced significant storm damage. Deputy Cass had apparently organized 4 men to ride the alternate route and determine whether the expedition was delayed, damaged, or gone. She pulled up when she saw them coming and counted them 4 riders, the deputy at the front, looking relieved in the specific way of officials who had been quietly dreading paperwork. "You're late," the deputy said. He said it like a man who'd rehearsed something harsher and abandoned it on approach. "Eastern Canyon wall came down," Eliza said. "We rerouted through an old mine tunnel." A silence. "Through a mine tunnel," the deputy repeated. "It was that or the open slope in a deteriorating storm," Colton said. He said it evenly, not defending, just clarifying. One of the rescue riders, she recognized him as young Davis from the livery, stared at them with an expression of pure disbelief that she found briefly satisfying. They rode into Duskmere together, the rescue party flanking the expedition riders, and the town registered their arrival the way small towns register the return of people it had already started telling stories about. She could see it in the faces on the boardwalk, the double take, the cluster of conversation that broke out before they'd even passed, the particular quality of attention that meant people had been talking and were now recalibrating what they'd said. Hank Dooley was standing outside the blacksmith shop. He watched them ride past with an expression she didn't have the energy to interpret, and she didn't look at him long enough to have to. The store was open. Of course it was open. Teddy had apparently managed, imperfectly but adequately, in her absence, which she had known he could, and which she'd used as a reason not to trust him, and which she now understood was something she was going to have to think about differently. She could see through the window that the shelving unit on the east wall had been rearranged in a way that made no logical sense, and would need to be fixed. She could also see a handwritten sign in the window that said "Back Soon," and beneath it, in Teddy's round, uncertain lettering, "In case you're wondering, she's fine." She stopped in front of the store and read the sign. She sat on her horse for a moment with the sign in front of her, and she felt something move through her chest that was too complicated to name cleanly. something that was partly about her brother and partly about being known, even imperfectly, by someone who'd put a sign in a window because he understood that people would wonder. She got off her horse and tied it at the post and went inside. Teddy came out from the back room at the sound of the bell, and when he saw her, he did what Teddy always did when he was relieved. He covered it immediately with something else, in this case, an expression of elaborate casualness. Back then, he said. Back, she said. Good trip? She looked at him. She thought about the ford and the ridge and the mine tunnel and Skip's shoulder and the ceiling coming down and the sound of the canyon wall collapsing and what she'd seen from the eastern face of the canyon looking west at the Greer installation. Informative, she said. He waited. He knew her well enough to know that informative from Eliza meant a story she wasn't telling yet, and that pushing would produce nothing. The sign was a good idea, she said. He blinked. What sign? She gestured at the window. Oh. He looked at it, slightly embarrassed. I thought people kept coming in and asking where you were, and I didn't know what to. He stopped. I just figured. It was good, she said again. And she went to the back room to find her records. The records were where she'd left them, which was a relief. She'd been vaguely afraid that Teddy's reorganization impulses had extended to the back room, but apparently some instinct for self-preservation had kept him away from the wooden box under the workbench. She pulled it out and put it on the table and opened it, and the familiar smell of 4 years of paper and ink and the particular dust of a room that was used for work rather than display greeted her. She started with the most recent 18 months. She was looking for the pattern she'd been running in her head on the ride back, and she found it almost immediately not because she'd doubted it was there, but because seeing it on paper was different from carrying it in memory. The clustering was clear. Every significant disruption to the northern supply route, every period of late payment, every delivery gap, every note she'd made about road conditions corresponded with specific weather events. And the weather events that caused canyon road closures were specifically those involving the watershed from the northwest, which was precisely the watershed that the Greer property sat within. She laid the receipts out in date order and marked the disruption periods with a pencil line, and then set the marked dates against what Alderman had told Colton about the timing of the Greer modifications. The overlap was not perfect. Nothing in reality was perfect, but it was consistent enough to mean something. She worked until the lamp needed refilling, and then she refilled it and kept working. Colton arrived at the store's side door. At some point, she wasn't certain of the time, with 2 plates of food from the saloon's kitchen, which provided meals to paying guests regardless of the hour, if you knew the right door to knock on. He set 1 plate in front of her without comment and sat on the far end of the workbench and ate his own while she worked, which was exactly the right behavior for the situation, and she ate hers without stopping the work. Alderman's coming to town tomorrow, he said, after a while. He sent word he wants to talk. Good, she said. She didn't look up from the receipts. Dorothea sent word to 2 of the other northern ranchers. They're interested. She put down her pencil. How interested? Interested enough to bring their own records. She looked at him. He was sitting on the workbench in the lamplight, plate empty, jacket off, the bandage on his forearm that Dorothea had dressed properly at the last ranch stop showing below his rolled sleeve. He looked like someone who'd been through a hard week and didn't feel the need to explain it to anyone. You did that while I was riding in, she said. You were going to need it eventually, he said. Seemed faster to start while you were looking at the records. She felt the familiar wariness rise, and then, for the first time in longer than she could account for, decided not to act on it. Thank you, she said. He nodded once, and that was sufficient. Vernon Alderman arrived the next afternoon, which was also when the county land office received a formal complaint not from Eliza, not yet, but from a man named Fletcher who owned the Waypoint water station and had been losing money to supply disruptions for 18 months, and had apparently decided the tunnel collapse was the final entry in a long list of things he was done tolerating quietly. Fletcher's complaint was about water rights and road access, and it named the Greer family, and it was imprecise and poorly documented, and would probably go nowhere on its own, but it put a name on record at the county level, and that had its own weight. Eliza heard about Fletcher's complaint from Dorothea Marsh, who had connections in the county seat, that Eliza was only beginning to understand. She filed the information and kept working. The meeting with Alderman happened in the store's back room, around the workbench that still had Eliza's receipts spread across it. Alderman came with his own records rougher than hers, kept with the handwriting of a man who'd never prioritized penmanship, and Dorothea brought 2 other northern ranchers, Cobb and a woman named Harriet Tyne, who ran a sheep operation and had the tight expression of someone who'd been angry for a long time and had finally found a room where she could do something with it. They sat around the workbench and they talked, and Eliza listened more than she spoke, letting the information accumulate before she organized it. What accumulated was substantial. Alderman had records showing that his supply costs had increased 40% in 18 months. Dorothea's were similar. Cobb had documentation of 3 separate instances where canyon road flooding had forced him to source emergency feed from suppliers connected to a distribution company that, if you followed the business registrations carefully, was associated with a name that was associated with the Greer family. Harriet Tyne had done something that none of the others had thought to do. She'd written down dates. Every date the canyon road had been impassable for the past 2 years, recorded in a small notebook with the specific detail of a woman who'd suspected something and decided to document it before she had proof. Harriet Tyne's notebook, combined with Eliza's receipts, combined with Cobb's supply records, produced a documented pattern that was no longer circumstantial in any ordinary sense of the word. It was a case, not a perfect case. Nothing was perfect. There would be arguments about the water rights modifications being technically legal, about correlation not being causation, about whether the Greer family's business relationships were coincidental rather than engineered. Those arguments would have to be answered, but they would have to be answered, and that was different from being ignored. Silas Greer heard about the meeting within 12 hours. Eliza didn't know how small towns moved information the way blood moved through a body, and she'd long since accepted that anything she did within Dustmere's boundaries would be known by anyone who cared to know it before 24 hours had passed. What she hadn't anticipated was how fast Silas Greer would move in response. He came to the store the morning after the meeting. He didn't come alone. He brought his elder son Marcus and a lawyer named Beaumont, who'd ridden in from the county seat, which meant Greer had started that process before he'd even come to speak to Eliza, which told her something useful about how worried he was. She was behind the counter when they came in. Teddy was in the back room. She'd known they were coming because Dorothea had sent word an hour earlier, another thing about Dorothea Marsh's county seat connections that Eliza was filing away for future reference. Silas Greer was 64 and had the particular authority of a man who'd gotten what he wanted for most of his adult life through a combination of money and the patience to wait out everyone who tried to tell him no. He was not physically large. The authority came from somewhere else, the practiced ease of a man who walked into rooms that already knew he was important. He looked at Eliza the way he would have looked at any store clerk, not dismissive exactly, just with the economy of attention he applied to people he considered essentially functional. Someone to transact with, not to engage. "Miss Carter," he said. "Mr. Greer," she said. Beaumont the lawyer was already scanning the room with the professional attentiveness of someone calculating what to work with. "I understand there's been a gathering here," Greer said. "Some concern about water management in the district." "There's been a business meeting," Eliza said. "Ranchers comparing records. That's not unusual. The records being compared concern my family's property. The records concern supply disruptions," she said. "Pattern of those disruptions is what we were looking at." Greer's expression didn't change much. He had the face of a man who'd learned a long time ago not to show what the face was doing. "My lawyers have reviewed our water rights modifications. They're consistent with the terms of our district allocation. The legal status of the modifications isn't what's at issue," Eliza said. "The effect of the modifications on the downstream watershed is what's at issue, which is a different question." Beaumont the lawyer looked at her with slightly more attention than he had before. "You seem quite certain of your position," Greer said. "I'm certain of the arithmetic," she said. "The position follows from that." Marcus Greer, who was 30-something and had his father's economy of expression without his father's confidence, had been looking around the store during this exchange with the focused attention of someone looking for something specific. His eyes landed on the workbench, visible through the backroom door, where the records from the previous day's meeting were still stacked. "Those your account books?" he asked. "Some of them," she said. My father is prepared to discuss a resolution, Marcus said. A commercial arrangement that addresses the supply disruption concerns in a practical way. Eliza looked at him, then at Silas Greer. What kind of arrangement, she said. Preferred supply relationship, Greer said. For your store and for the northern ranches, your store services. Fixed pricing, guaranteed access, managed through a distribution arrangement my family would establish. She understood immediately what he was describing. It was elegant, in the way of things that solved the problem they'd created by replacing it with a different and more controlled problem. The northern ranchers would get reliable supply managed by a distribution company owned by the Greer family, priced by the Greer family, dependent on the continued goodwill of the Greer family. Canyon Road would become less critical because the supply would route through Greer-controlled channels. The records Eliza and the others had assembled would become moot because the disruption pattern they documented would be characterized as a problem that had already been resolved. And Carter's feed and dry goods would become a subsidiary node in a supply network it didn't control. She was quiet for a moment. No, she said. Greer's expression shifted very slightly. You might want to think about what you're declining. I've thought about it, she said. The answer is no, Miss Carter. He put both hands on the counter, and she understood this was the gesture of a man bringing his full weight to bear in a conversation. You run a small business with a disputed bank account and a family you're responsible for. What you're proposing to do with those records, a formal complaint, a council hearing, a county proceeding is going to be expensive in time and money you don't have, against a family with resources considerably beyond what you're looking at. She kept her eyes on him and kept her voice level and said, I know what I'm looking at, Mr. Greer. I've been looking at it carefully for a long time. He held her gaze for another moment. Then he stepped back from the counter. Beaumont, he said, and the lawyer turned, and the three of them walked out of the store in the way of men who've had a conversation go wrong and are regrouping, not retreating. The bell above the door settled into silence after them. Teddy emerged from the back room, where he had clearly been listening through the gap in the door. That seemed bad, he said. That was productive, she said. Now I know they're worried. Worried men made mistakes. She'd seen it enough times in accounts. The debtors who got aggressive were always the ones who understood the numbers were against them. Calm debtors were the difficult ones, because they still had room to maneuver. Aggressive debtors were almost there. She went back to the records. The county land office received Eliza's formal filing 4 days after the Greer visit. She'd written it herself, over 3 evenings, with the same precision she applied to the store's account-specific, documented, arithmetically supported, stripped of the emotional freight that would give anyone an excuse to dismiss it as personal grievance rather than substantiated complaint. She filed it not just at the county level, but at the District Water Authority, which was a separate body with jurisdiction over watershed management, and which she'd learned about from Harriet Tyne, who'd looked into it specifically because she'd suspected the Greer modifications were in a regulatory gray area, that the Water Authority had more power to address than the county court. Harriet Tyne was, Eliza had discovered, a woman who'd been doing her own version of what Eliza was doing, building a body of knowledge quietly, in the margins of her daily work, against the day it might be needed. She'd been doing it longer than Eliza had. They sat at Eliza's workbench on the evening, after the filing, and Harriet said, I've been at this for 2 years, with the tiredness of someone who'd been carrying weight for a long time, and was only now able to set part of it down. You were right to document it, Eliza said. A lot of good it did alone, Harriet said. It's not alone anymore, Eliza said. The council meeting was called 10 days after the filing. Not by the council, by the Water Authority, which had jurisdiction over water rights disputes, and had reviewed Eliza's complaint with sufficient interest to request a formal hearing. The Cattlemen's Council was invited to present, which gave them the opportunity to be part of the resolution rather than subjects of it. A distinction that Eliza had suggested to Deputy Cass in private because she understood that giving men a graceful way to do the right thing was more effective than requiring them to do it through gritted teeth. Horace Bright was the problem. She'd known Horace Bright was going to be the problem from the moment she'd understood the Greer family's supply network, because Bright's general store was one of the alternative suppliers that had benefited from the Canyon Road disruptions. Not knowingly, maybe she'd given him the benefit of that doubt, provisionally, but the benefit he'd received was real regardless of his awareness. And a man who'd benefited from a situation was not naturally inclined to vote against it, even when the evidence was placed in front of him with care. She went to see Horace Bright the day before the hearing. He was in his store when she arrived, which was a large, well-stocked operation that occupied a corner lot on Main Street and was, by any measure, the more successful business on the block. He looked up when she came in, and his expression had the specific quality of a man who'd known a conversation was coming and had not been looking forward to it. "Eliza Mae," he said. "Horace," she said. She sat across from him in the small office at the back of the store, and she laid out what she had, not all of it, not the complete record, but enough. The specific transactions in which Bright's store had received orders from northern ranches during Canyon Road closure periods. The pricing patterns those orders showed. The relationship between those patterns and the supply network she'd documented. He listened. She watched him listen, and she watched him understand what he was hearing, and she watched the understanding change his face. "I didn't know about the modifications," he said when she finished. "I know," she said. "I just had more orders during those periods. I thought it was seasonal." It wasn't. He was quiet for a long moment. "What happens to my store if this comes out the way you're saying?" he said. "That depends on how you behave at the hearing tomorrow," she said. He looked at her. She said, "If you sit on your hands and let the council stall this, what you describe becomes part of the pattern I've documented. If you support the hearing, if you bring your records and let the Water Authority see the full picture, you're a business that was used without its knowledge, and that's a different position." She let him think about that. "You're a harder woman than people give you credit for," he said. "People give me very little credit at all," she said. "I've learned to work with what's there." He came to the hearing. The hearing was held in the town hall, which got its meaningful use after all. The Water Authority sent a man named Prescott, who was 40-something, and had the patient systemata of someone who read documents for a living and had no personal investment in what they contained. He read Eliza's filing. He read the supporting records. He listened to Vernon Alderman's account, and Harriet Tynes' account, and Cobb's account, and he asked questions that were specific and technical about watershed flow rates and the physical mechanism of the diversion channels and the engineering basis for the modifications the Greer family had made. Silas Greer's lawyer Beaumont was present and presented the case that the modifications were within the legal parameters of the Greer water rights allocation. Prescott listened to this also and asked equally specific questions about the downstream impact studies that had been conducted before the modifications were implemented. Beaumont said the modifications were within legal parameters. Prescott asked again about downstream impact studies. Beaumont said the modifications were within legal parameters. The third time Prescott asked, he wrote something in his notebook. Eliza watched this from the second row. She'd decided not to sit at the front. She'd made her presentation in the filing, and the filing was doing the work. Sitting at the front would have made it about her, and she wanted it to be about the records. Colton sat beside her. He'd been in the room since before the hearing started, which meant he'd gotten there before she had, which she hadn't expected. He didn't say anything during the hearing, and she didn't say anything to him. They sat in the same room and let the work they'd done speak for itself. When Prescott had finished his questions, he read something from a reference document he'd brought, and then he said that the Water Authority would be issuing an order requiring the Greer family to submit downstream impact assessment before any existing modifications could remain operational. Pending that assessment, the modifications were to be suspended. The cost of the assessment would be borne by the Greer family under the District Water Management Code. The suspension of the modifications would restore the natural watershed flow to the canyon drainage. Canyon Road would be safe again. It was not a complete resolution. The Greers weren't charged with anything. Not yet the Water Authority had regulatory power, not criminal jurisdiction, and the question of whether what they'd done constituted deliberate economic harm rather than technical violation was a longer argument for a different venue. The suspension was real and immediate, and the impact assessment requirement meant a public record that the Greer family's modifications had operated without regard for downstream effect, and that record would be harder to walk back from than a private arrangement. When the hearing closed, Prescott approached Eliza in the hall outside. "Your documentation was unusually thorough," he said. He said it with the neutrality of a man who evaluated documentation professionally and was offering a technical assessment. "Thank you," she said. "The Water Authority may request additional records as the assessment proceeds." "They're available," she said. He nodded and went to speak to Beaumont, who did not look like a man who'd had a good afternoon. Dorothea Marsh appeared at Eliza's shoulder. "Harriet's already talking about a Northern Ranchers cooperative," she said, "for the supply route, managed collectively." "That could work," Eliza said. "She wants you involved." Eliza looked across the room at Harriet Tyne, who was talking to Cobb and Vernon Alderman with the animated energy of someone who'd been holding a plan in reserve and could finally say it out loud. "I have a store to run," Eliza said. "You could do both," Dorothea said. It was not a suggestion. It was the flat statement of a woman who'd identified a practical fact. Eliza didn't answer immediately. She was watching the room, the Greer family near the door, the deputy looking relieved, Horace Bright talking quietly to two council members, with the expression of a man positioning himself carefully, the Northern Ranchers clustered together with the particular energy of people who'd been told yes for the first time in a long time. Outside the town hall doors, which someone had propped open to the afternoon light, she could see the main street of Dustmere, the water tower, the south end of town where Carter's Feed and Dry Goods had its sign above the door. The sign her father had painted, the sign she'd repainted herself 2 years ago, because the original had faded, and she didn't have money for a sign painter, and it turned out that painting a sign was not beyond her capabilities. Like most things that weren't beyond her capabilities, as long as she was willing to learn them. She thought about what 4 years of records looked like when you stopped reading them as accounts and started reading them as evidence. She thought about a mine tunnel in a canyon wall and the sound of moving air in the dark. She thought about a man at the back of a room saying, "She knows it better, I'd bet." She thought about what Teddy had said to Colton on a rainy street. "She does this thing, where she volunteers for half the thing." "Tell Harriet I'll talk to her next week," Eliza said. Dorothea nodded, satisfied. Eliza found Colton near the hall's side door, where he'd retreated during the post-hearing conversations. He was looking at the street through the door's small window with the same attention he gave most things complete, unpretentious. "How's the arm?" she said. "Better," he said. "How's the filing?" "Moving," she said. "Slowly, the way these things move, but in the right direction." He turned from the window. "What happens now?" she considered. The impact assessment. Cooperative conversations. The Greer family's next move, which would come, because people with resources didn't stop moving simply because they'd lost a round. A bank account that still needed addressing. Teddy and the reorganized shelving unit. Her mother's mending in the lamplight. Now, she said, "I go back to the store. There are accounts that need attention. Teddy's done something inadvisable to the east wall shelving, and I need to fix it before someone tries to find something and can't." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd been learning to read, the one that was quieter than most people's expressions, that said things without manufacturing them. "And after the store," he said. She looked at him. She understood what he was asking, and it was a larger question than the phrasing suggested. And she didn't yet have a complete answer to it, and she suspected that any answer she gave now would be provisional in the way of things she'd been too cautious to consider fully. "Come to the store at 7, she said. "We can figure out the rest of it then." It was not a declaration. It was not a resolution. It was Eliza Mae Carter being exactly as bold as she'd decided to be, and not more than that which was, she thought, as she walked out of the town hall and into the afternoon light, exactly the right amount for now. Colton came to the store at 7. She'd half expected he wouldn't not, because he was the kind of man who said things he didn't mean, but because she'd been conditioning herself for years to expect the lesser version of any outcome, so that the disappointment, when it came, landed on prepared ground. It was a habit she'd built so gradually that she'd stopped recognizing it as a habit. It had become simply how she operated, the same way keeping records had become how she operated. The same way checking the sky before she planned a route had become how she operated as reflex, not choice. He came through the side door at 2 minutes past 7, which was close enough to 7 that she'd count it, and he brought 2 cups of coffee from the saloon's kitchen and set one on the counter in front of her without asking whether she wanted it. She wanted it. Teddy had gone home an hour earlier, after she'd spent 45 minutes rearranging the east wall, shelving back into its original order while he explained, with genuine bafflement, why his system was actually more logical. She'd listened to the full explanation, and then done it her way anyway, and he'd left not angry exactly. But in that state, he sometimes occupied a feeling right in principle and overruled in practice, which was a condition she recognized, because she'd lived it most of her life from the other direction. The store was quiet in the particular way of business spaces. After closing the inventory present and accounted for, the lamp on the counter throwing a steady circle, the sounds of Main Street muffled by walls and distance. She'd always liked the store at this hour. It was the only part of the day that was entirely hers. Colton sat on the same end of the workbench he'd occupied the night she'd worked through the records, as if the spot had been designated. He drank his coffee. She drank hers. The Greers will push back on the impact assessment, she said. It wasn't where she'd intended to start, but it was where her mind had been since the hearing, and she'd never been good at approaching the things she was actually thinking about through the side door of smaller conversation. They will, he said. Beaumont will find something in the assessment process to challenge. That's what lawyers do. I know. She turned her cup in her hands. The assessment has to be conducted by a Water Authority-approved examiner. Beaumont will try to influence the examiner's selection. That's the next pressure point. Prescott seemed solid. Prescott's the authority's representative. He doesn't conduct the assessment himself. The assessment goes to an independent examiner from a panel. She paused. I wrote to the Water Authority today, asking about the panel composition and the selection process. I want to know before Beaumont does. Colton looked at her with the expression she'd been learning to read. Since the square, the one that was not surprise, but was something adjacent to it, the expression of a man recalibrating what he'd already understood to be true. You wrote that today, he said. Between the hearing and 7 o'clock. And I fixed the shelving, she said. It was a busy afternoon. He almost smiled. The almost was becoming familiar. She'd started cataloging the variations of it, the way she cataloged terrain features, as things she'd need to navigate more of and wanted to understand better. Cooperative Dorothea mentioned, he said. Northern ranchers managing the supply route collectively. You said you'd talk to Harriet Tyne. Next week. What do you think it needs to work? She thought about it. Not the answer she'd give to Harriet, which would be practical and specific, but the underlying reality of what a cooperative supply operation required to survive in this particular district with these particular people. Trust, she said, and someone to keep the accounts who isn't one of the ranchers, because the moment a rancher is keeping accounts for other ranchers, you have a conflict every time there's a lean season. She paused. And a supply agreement that doesn't depend on the Canyon Road. The Canyon Road will be more reliable once the Greer modifications are suspended, but more reliable isn't reliable. The alternate route needs to be an established option, not an emergency measure. Your route, he said. Someone's route, she said. It shouldn't depend on one person knowing it. He nodded slowly. The mining tunnel section will need proper assessment. If the cooperative is going to use the eastern route regularly, they need to know what's in there and whether it can be made safer. She hadn't thought about the tunnel in those terms as infrastructure rather than emergency exit. She turned the idea over. The tunnel was real, and it connected the eastern face of the canyon wall to passable ground on the other side. If the ceiling were properly assessed and the worst sections shored, it would provide passage even when the main canyon road and the ridge section were compromised. That's a construction project, she said. It's a couple months of work with the right people, he said. I know someone in Wyoming who's done mine rehabilitation. It's not the same as new construction. Most of it is assessment and targeted reinforcement of existing structure. She looked at him. You're planning to stay. She hadn't meant it as a challenge or an accusation. It was an observation, offered plainly, the same way she offered most things without elaboration, waiting to see what the recipient did with the plain version before she offered anything more complicated. He met her eyes. The alderman delivery is done. My contract obligation is finished. He paused. But there's an unresolved situation with the Greer water rights that somebody who knows the northern range should probably stay close to. And there's a mining tunnel that needs assessment. And there's a supply cooperative that's going to need more work than it knows it needs. Another pause. And there's a store that apparently employs one person who's doing the work of 4 and another person who rearranges shelving. Teddy is improving, she said. Slowly, he said. Slowly, she agreed. The lamp on the counter burned steadily between them. Outside, the street sounds of Dustmere, someone leaving the saloon, a horse at the hitching post. The wind that had been a constant companion for weeks moved through the night in their ordinary patterns. Inside, the store held its inventory and its ledgers, and the wooden box of records that had turned out to be worth more than anyone had thought. And Eliza sat with her coffee and the honest fact of a man who'd asked to stay and tried to decide what she wanted to do with both. "I don't need rescuing," she said. It came out slightly more abruptly than she'd intended. "I know that," he said. He said it without flinching, without the slight defensive adjustment of a man who'd expected the remark but found it unjust. "Just I know that. Flat and true. I've been managing this store and these accounts and this supply route and this family for 4 years," she said. "I've done it alone, because alone was what was available, and I learned to make alone work, and I got good at it." She was saying something she'd never said clearly to anyone, not even her mother, and saying it to Colton Hayes in a lamplit store at 7 in the evening felt simultaneously wrong in its context and right in its timing. "I don't know how to," she stopped. "Accept help that isn't charity," he said. She looked at him. "You've been offered charity plenty," he said. "Pitying kind, and the condescending kind, and the kind that comes with a condition you find out about later. And you've gotten good at rejecting it before it can do anything to you." He set down his coffee cup. "What I'm offering isn't that. What I'm offering is 2 people who are both useful looking at a problem that's bigger than one person and deciding to work it together. That's not charity, that's just arithmetic." She was quiet for a moment. "You've been thinking about how to say that," she said. "Since about the 3rd day on the plateau," he said. She looked at her coffee cup. She thought about half things, and the philosophy she'd built around them, and what it had cost her that she'd stopped adding up. She thought about her father at the bank, and the accounts that kept almost balancing, and her mother's mending in the lamplight, and Teddy's sign in the window in case you're wondering. "She's fine," and Clara Foss's hands around her coffee cup, saying it meant the difference. She thought about standing in a mine tunnel in the dark, holding a lamp, walking toward the sound of moving air, because moving toward it was the only rational choice. 7 o'clock tomorrow," she said. "There are accounts to review for the cooperative proposal, and I could use a second set of eyes on the pattern I'm building for the Water Authority." Something in his face settled, not relief, not triumph, just the settling of something that had been held in slight suspension. 7 o'clock, he said. He finished his coffee and said good night, and she listened to the side door close, and then she sat alone in the store for a while longer. Not working, just sitting, which was something she almost never did, and which turned out to be, tonight, exactly what was needed. The weeks that followed were not clean or simple, or arranged into the kind of narrative arc that makes a satisfying story told quickly. They were the weeks of actual work, the kind that doesn't announce itself and doesn't resolve in a single meeting or a single document, but accumulates through sustained attention applied to specific problems over time. The Water Authority's impact assessment examiner was a woman named Dr. Agnes Crow, who arrived from the county seat 3 weeks after the hearing, and who turned out to be, in Eliza's estimation, exactly the right kind of thorough. She was 51, methodical, unimpressed by the Greer family's lawyer, or by Vernon Alderman's agitated lobbying, or by Deputy Cass's nervous hovering, and she spent 5 days on the ground examining the watershed, the diversion channels, the canyon drainage, and the downstream effects before she wrote a single word of her report. Eliza accompanied her on 2 of those days at Dr. Crow's request, because Eliza had the most comprehensive documentation of the downstream supply disruptions in Dr. Crow wanted the person who kept the records to walk her through them, in the field rather than on paper. They rode the northern route together, not the canyon road, which was still officially rated uncertain pending the assessment, but the alternate route Eliza had pioneered, and Eliza explained what she'd seen and when she'd seen it and how she'd recorded it. And Dr. Crow asked questions that were technical and precise and required technical and precise answers. Eliza gave them. On the second day, riding back along the eastern plateau, with the sky clear and the northern range opening ahead of them, Dr. Crow said, "How long have you been tracking these routes?" 4 years, Eliza said, "since I took over the deliveries. And the maps you showed me, those are all your own work?" "Yes." Dr. Crow rode in silence for a moment. "My office has been dealing with watershed disputes in this district for 12 years, she said. We've never had documentation from a private individual at this level of specificity. We usually have to reconstruct the supply impact data ourselves, which takes months." She paused. "Your record saved us approximately 4 months of investigative work." Eliza thought about 4 years of habit, the habit of writing things down, because she'd been caught unprepared twice, and decided that wasn't happening again. The habit of keeping records, because records were how she understood what was happening. The habit that Gerald Fitch at the bank had looked at as evidence of a small mind attending to small things. "I just kept what was in front of me," she said. "That's what most people don't do, Doctor," Crow said. The assessment report took 2 more weeks to complete. During those 2 weeks, Silas Greer made one more attempt at a private resolution, not through Beaumont this time, but through a mutual acquaintance who approached Eliza at the general store with an envelope that contained a number. The number was substantial, substantially more than she'd expected, which told her something important about how much the Greers stood to lose. She sent the envelope back unopened. She heard about this through Dorothea, who had apparently heard about it through a chain of connections that Eliza had given up trying to map. Dorothea's comment was, "Smart." Eliza's comment was, "They shouldn't have made the offer. Now I know what they're worth to themselves." The assessment report, when it came, was thorough and technical and largely conclusive. Dr. Crow's findings established that the Greer family's water diversion modifications had materially altered the downstream flow pattern in the canyon watershed in ways that exceeded the scope of their legal water rights allocation. The modifications had not been reviewed for downstream impact as required under the District Water Management Code, a requirement that Beaumont had argued was discretionary and that Dr. Crow's report established was mandatory. The canyon road flooding events of the past 18 months were directly attributable to the modified flow pattern. The Water Authority's ruling required the Greer family to remove or redesign the modifications at their own expense, submit to annual watershed audits for 5 years, and pay a remediation fee to the District Water Management Fund. The fee was not punitive in the legal sense, but it was not small. The ruling did not address the economic harm to the northern ranchers directly. That was a separate proceeding, and one that would take longer and require a different kind of argument. But it established the factual foundation for that argument, and Eliza had already begun building it. Silas Greer's lawyer filed an appeal. Eliza had expected this. She'd also, quietly, contacted a lawyer in the county seat, not Beaumont's firm, the other one, which was smaller and less expensive, and had handled 2 water rights cases in the past decade, with outcomes that suggested competence, and retained his services on behalf of the Northern Ranchers Cooperative, which had by this point been formally organized with Harriet Tyne as chair and Eliza as accounts manager. The lawyer's name was Edmund Park, and he was 38 and slightly rumpled, and had the specific energy of a man who liked winning arguments that other people had given up on. He read Eliza's documentation and said, "This is unusually complete." She was beginning to recognize this as a specific compliment offered by specific kinds of professionals. "Thank you," she said. "The appeal is going to focus on the technical classification of the modifications," he said. "Beaumont will argue that Dr. Crow applied too narrow an interpretation of the water rights allocation scope. That's a legal argument, not a factual one, which means it's slower and messier than the assessment proceeding. How long? If it goes to district court, 18 months. Maybe more." She did the arithmetic, what 18 months of continued uncertainty meant for the cooperative, for the northern ranchers, for the supply route. It wasn't paralyzing. The modifications were suspended pending the appeal, which meant the Canyon Road was already showing improved conditions. The cooperative had structured its supply operations around the eastern route as a primary alternative, which meant they were no longer dependent on the Canyon Road functioning perfectly. The economic pressure that the Greer family had been able to apply through the water diversion was, in practical terms, already diminished. "Can we move the rancher's economic harm claim through a separate proceeding while the appeal runs?" she asked. Edmund Park looked at her for a moment. "That's a smart question. I have a lot of them," she said. "Yes, the harm claim runs on a different track. The appeal doesn't stay it. Then we file the harm claim now and let both proceed in parallel," she said. "The appeal may be strategic delay. I'd rather not let them delay us on the harm question while they're running out the clock on the technical one." He made a note. The harm claim was filed 6 weeks after the assessment ruling. By the time the claim was filed, Carter's Feed and Dry Goods had its most organized backroom in 4 years, which was partly because Eliza had imposed a new filing system, and partly because Colton had built 3 additional shelving units from wood he'd sourced from the Galt Ranch, where there was apparently always spare lumber, if you were willing to haul it yourself. The shelving units were not beautiful. They were level and solid, and exactly the right dimensions for the boxes they held, which was, in Eliza's view, the correct set of priorities for shelving. Teddy had taken on the bulk of the daily deliveries, which had freed Eliza for the legal and administrative work that the cooperative and the water authority proceedings required. He was better at the deliveries than she'd allowed herself to notice. He had a natural ease with people that she didn't have and didn't pretend to, and ranchers who'd been brusque with her in the past were warmer with him, which was useful regardless of how she felt about it. She told him this once, directly, which was harder than it should have been, and which she suspected she should have told him years earlier. He'd been surprised. Then he'd said, "You're not going to make a habit of this, are you?" "Probably not," she'd said. "Good," he'd said. "It's unsettling." But he'd smiled, and so had she, and the moment had been what it was imperfect and genuine, which was the only kind of moment that left anything lasting. The appeal played out over 14 months. 14 months was not a narrative event. It was a long sequence of ordinary days punctuated by irregular developments, a filing here, a ruling there, a request for additional documentation that sent Eliza back to the wooden box under the workbench for specific records she'd kept, and that turned out, each time, to be there. The cooperative operated through those months, imperfectly, working out the friction points of collective decision-making and shared costs and the specific difficulties of getting ranchers who'd each operated independently for decades to trust a common process. Harriet Tyne chaired those meetings with a combination of impatience and determination that Eliza found both exhausting and effective. She kept the accounts and built the documentation and answered Edmund Park's questions and wrote letters to the Water Authority and attended 4 county hearings. She also ran the store. Every day. The store. She thought sometimes about what it meant that she'd been carrying this much for this long and hadn't noticed the weight because she'd never put any of it down. The weight had simply become her normal, the way bad posture becomes normal. You stop noticing it until something changes, and you realize how much you'd been compensating. What changed was incremental. Teddy getting better at the deliveries. Cooperative taking on its own administrative mass and distributing some of the operational weight she'd been carrying alone. Edmund Park handling the legal proceedings without requiring her to manage them. Colton's presence, which was not dramatic and did not announce itself, but which was, she came to understand over those 14 months, the thing that made the rest of it possible. Not because he did the work. He did some work, the tunnel assessment, which had taken 6 weeks, and the Wyoming rehabilitation specialist he'd mentioned, and resulted in a formal structural report that Eliza had added to the cooperative's infrastructure file. He did accounts on evenings when she was falling behind. He handled the Galt lumber runs and 2 fence repairs on the delivery route, and a conversation with Vernon Alderman that she'd been putting off because she'd known it would be uncomfortable. But mostly what he did was be present without requiring anything specific of her presence. He'd learned with a quickness that she suspected had less to do with intuition and more to do with careful attention, that she needed space to think and silence when she was working in directness rather than comfort when something was going wrong. He gave her these things without being told, which was either luck or the result of someone paying close attention, and she suspected it was the second. She wasn't uncomplicated about it. She brought the habit of self-protection to it, the way she brought the habit of keeping records to everything persistently, sometimes uselessly, occasionally usefully. There were weeks when she pulled back without being able to explain why. When the proximity of another person who knew what she was doing felt like exposure rather than support, and she needed to put some distance between herself and it until she could remember that exposure and visibility were not the same thing as vulnerability, and that vulnerability wasn't the same thing as weakness, and that she'd been confusing all 3 of these for so long that untangling them was going to take longer than 14 months. She was working on it. One evening in late winter, cold enough that the store needed both lamps and the small stove in the back room, Colton brought a letter. He'd been to the post office, which was a chore he'd taken over, in the way he'd taken over things he noticed needed doing. And he brought the mail back, along with the occasional piece of county business addressed to the cooperative. This letter was addressed to Eliza personally, from the Water Authority's main office in the county seat. She opened it at the counter. It was a formal inquiry. The Water Authority was establishing a new position, a district supply route coordinator, responsible for maintaining and updating the documented record of supply routes, alternative passages, and seasonal road conditions across the district. The position had been proposed in direct response to the Northern Ranchers case, which had demonstrated the value of systematic route documentation. And the Water Authority was soliciting applications from qualified individuals within the district. They had enclosed a copy of the job description. At the bottom of the cover letter, in a handwritten edition, Dr. Agnes Crow had written, "Miss Carter, I hope you will consider this seriously. The district has needed this function for 20 years. We simply did not have the right person. We may now." Eliza read the letter twice. Then she set it on the counter and looked at it. Colton had read it over her shoulder. She'd angled it so he could, which was itself something she'd done unconsciously and noticed only after. He didn't say anything immediately, which was correct. It would mean regular travel on the northern routes, she said. Documentation. Coordination with the Water Authority and the county road office. Everything you've been doing for 4 years, he said. But officially. And paid, she said. That too. She picked up the letter again. She thought about Gerald Fitch at the bank and the quarterly review that had been pending for 2 years and that had finally resolved in Carter's favor 3 months ago, partly because the cooperative's formation had added institutional accounts to the store's ledger, and partly because Eliza had gone back to the bank with records organized in a way that made declining her unreasonable even by Gerald Fitch's standards. She'd won that argument at last. But winning it had taken everything she had, and there was a part of her that understood she couldn't keep running the store, managing the cooperative accounts, supporting the legal proceedings, and documenting the supply routes at the level each of them required without something giving. "Teddy can manage the store," she said. "He's been managing it." "He has," Colton said. "He'd need someone for accounts. He's never going to be reliable with accounts." "There's a woman who works for Horace Bright's store on the administrative side," Colton said. "I talked to her last month. She mentioned she'd be open to other arrangements." Eliza turned her head and looked at him. "You talked to her last month," she said. "I thought the letter might come," he said. "Dr. Crow told you." "She mentioned the position was being developed," he said. "She didn't tell me anything she wasn't supposed to tell me." Eliza held the letter. She held the fact that a man had talked to an accountant last month because he'd thought a letter might come, because he'd thought far enough ahead to prepare the ground she might need without telling her, because telling her would have felt like presumption. She thought about presumption and preparation, and the difference between someone who managed you and someone who made room for you. And she understood that she was sitting in a moment she'd been too careful to expect. "I'm going to apply," she said. "I know," he said. "And if I get it, the store goes to Teddy, and I take the route coordination position, and the cooperative accounts stay with me." "That's a lot," he said. "It is," she agreed. "I'll probably complain about it regularly." "I expect so," he said. She set the letter down. She looked at the store, the shelving units, his and hers, running the length of the east wall, the wooden box that had turned out to contain more than she'd known, the lamp throwing its steady circle on the counter. "You said something on the ride out," she said. "When you first asked me to come on the expedition, you said you wanted someone to help build something where nobody was judged by what they looked like or where they started." He waited. "That's not a small thing to build," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not. I've never been good at things I can't finish quickly," she said. "I start them and I commit to them, and then I run into the part where it takes longer than I planned, and She stopped. "I hold on too tight, and I pull too hard, and sometimes I break the thing I'm trying to keep." "I know," he said. "You've seen me do it with Randall," he said. "You could have made room for him, and you held him at arm's length instead, even after the ford crossing. It took until the tunnel for you to let him be useful." She hadn't expected him to say something that specific. The accuracy of it landed with a slight sting that she recognized as the feeling of being seen in a way that required acknowledgement rather than defense. "Yes," she said. "And with Teddy," he said, You knew he was capable of more, and you didn't give it to him, because giving it to him meant depending on it. She said nothing, and with me, he said. Not accusatory, just completing the list. Yes, she said again. I don't think those are flaws you fix, he said. I think they're habits you notice, and decide what to do with when you notice them. He paused. I'm not asking you to stop being careful. I'm asking you to notice when careful becomes something else. She sat with that for a moment. The stove in the back room made its small sounds. The lamp burned. When you first rode into the square, she said, I thought you were passing through. I was planning to, he said. What changed? He looked at her steadily. You did, he said. The way you turned and left. You didn't perform anything. You just turned and left, and you were holding those ledgers, and you had a quality of not dignity exactly. More like you had the full measure of what you were worth, and you weren't asking anyone else to confirm it. He paused. I hadn't seen that in a long time. I wasn't sure I'd seen it before. She understood then that what he was describing wasn't what she'd felt. What she'd felt was the opposite, the familiar calculation of retreat, the practiced art of exit before the next humiliation. She'd thought she was performing composure, and she'd apparently been performing something else entirely. Something she hadn't known, she possessed until he named it. That was a strange thing to learn about yourself. I was running, she said. You were walking, he said. There's a difference. The district supply route coordinator position was advertised at the county level in early spring. Eliza submitted her application with the full supporting documentation, 4 years of maps, delivery records, the route survey she'd conducted on the northern plateau, and Dr. Crow's letter. She submitted it without seconding herself, which was not natural, and required the specific effort of doing the thing, and not immediately finding reasons it was insufficient. Edmund Park called the appeal in late spring. The district court upheld the Water Authority's original ruling, rejecting the Greer family's technical challenge to Dr. Crow's interpretation of the water rights allocation scope. The modifications were to be removed. The remediation fee stood. The Greers could pursue further appeal at the state level, and Beaumont would almost certainly advise it. But the practical immediate outcome the watershed restored, the Canyon Road recovering, was no longer contingent on that process. The harm claim settlement came 6 weeks after the appeal ruling, because with the technical question resolved, the Greer family's leverage in the harm proceeding was substantially diminished. The settlement established a fund, administered by the Water Authority, to compensate the northern ranchers for documented supply disruptions over the 18-month period. The compensation amounts were based on Eliza's records, the delivery logs, the price differential data, the payment pattern analysis she'd built over those weeks at the workbench. Every dollar in that settlement fund traced back to records she'd kept because she'd been caught unprepared twice and decided that wasn't happening again. Vernon Alderman came to the store to tell her about the settlement figure. He came alone, without Cobb or Harriet or the buffer of a group, and he sat down across from her at the backroom workbench, and he said, with the difficulty of a man who didn't find this kind of conversation natural, I owe you more than what's in that account. She looked at him. The $60 is settled, she said. The cooperative's restructured payment arrangement had resolved the alderman debt 3 months earlier. I'm not talking about the $60, he said. She let the silence be what it was. I've been in this district for 30 years, he said. And for 30 years I've watched people get pushed around by whoever had the most water rights and the most lawyers. And every time somebody tried to do something about it, it went nowhere because nobody had the numbers. He paused. You had the numbers. You had them before you knew what they were for. She thought about what to say and came up with something honest rather than gracious. I didn't have them alone, she said. Harriet Tyne kept dates for 2 years. Cobb documented his emergency sourcing. Dorothea tracked her cost increases. I just had more records than any one of them because I was delivering to all of them. That's the thing about being the one people don't notice, Alderman said. You see everything. She sat with that. You were one of the people who didn't notice, she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a fact, offered the same way she offered most things. He received it the same way he'd received the account restructuring, with the blunt acknowledgement of a man who didn't waste time defending things he knew were indefensible. I was, he said. I'm trying to be less of that. She nodded. That was enough for now. The Water Authority appointment letter arrived in early summer. It was formal and official, and addressed to Miss Eliza Mae Carter, and it offered her the district supply route coordinator position at a salary that was more than the store had paid her in any year of operation. She read it standing at the counter while Teddy finished the morning's inventory, and she read it twice, and then she set it on the counter and went to the back room and stood there by herself for about 3 minutes, with her hands pressed flat on the workbench. She wasn't sure what she felt. It was too large for a single thing. She felt the 4 years that had led to it, every delivery, every map annotation, every cold morning and flooded road, and late payment argued in a bank office by a woman who knew the numbers and couldn't get the man behind the desk to hear them. She felt the square where men had laughed, and a stranger had said she knows it better, I'd bet. She felt the mine tunnel and the sound of moving air in the dark. She felt the weight of what she'd been carrying, and she felt what it would mean to set part of it down deliberately rather than having it taken, which was a different sensation entirely. She went back to the counter and picked up the letter and called for Teddy. He came out from the back room with an inventory sheet in one hand and a pencil behind his ear and the looks of someone who'd been counting sacks and had lost the thread. She put the letter on the counter in front of him. He read it. She watched his face, the comprehension. Then the implications of the comprehension. Then the thing that settled after the implications, which was something close to pride without the performance of it. You got it, he said. I got it, she said. He looked at her and she looked at him, and for a moment they were just two people who'd grown up in the same house and carried the same store and watched the same parents age in the same lamplight. And there was something between them that didn't need words and didn't get them. The store, he said. The store is yours, she said. With Margaret from Bright's doing the accounts. She'd already spoken to Margaret. Margaret had already said yes. I can do the accounts, Teddy said. Teddy, she said. I can't do the accounts, he said. Fair enough. She started to turn away and he said, Eliza. She turned back. That sign, he said, in the window. When you were gone, I told you it was a good idea. You did. He picked up his inventory sheet. I knew you'd come back. I just thought other people didn't know. People who didn't know you. He paused. I wanted them to know too. She held that, I know, she said. She took the letter and walked out of the store into the early summer morning, which was clear and warm, the kind of day that the frontier offered occasionally, without warning, as evidence that it wasn't always trying to kill you. Main Street was busy with the particular morning energy of a working town wagons moving. People on errands, the sound of the blacksmith shop starting up, the smell of bread from the bakery 2 doors down. She walked to the south end of town and stood in front of the store and looked at the sign her father had painted and that she'd repainted when it faded. And she looked at the street where she'd grown up and the town that had laughed at her and the boardwalk where she'd walked 1,000 mornings carrying ledgers and canvas bags and the specific weight of being a person nobody expected to matter. She didn't feel triumph. She'd been expecting to feel triumph, and what she felt instead was something quieter and more durable, a kind of settled clarity. The feeling of a thing that has right position after a long time of being slightly wrong. Colton found her there. He had a habit of finding her when she was standing still, which she'd come to understand was not coincidence, but attention. He paid attention to her patterns, and he showed up at the places they pointed to. This was either charming or something she'd need to have a conversation about at some point, and she'd decided for now it was charming. She handed him the letter. He read it. He handed it back. Congratulations, he said. Thank you, she said. They stood together on the south end of Main Street in the early summer morning, and she thought about what it meant to build something, not to be given something, not to be handed something, but to have stayed in one place long enough and worked hard enough and kept precise enough records that the thing you needed to build had the materials it required when the moment came. She thought about what Colton had described seeing when she left the square, not performance, not dignity, just someone who knew their own worth without waiting for confirmation. She still didn't feel like that person most of the time, but she understood now that the feeling was not the point. Point was the record she'd kept, the maps she'd drawn, the route she'd taken when the canyon road was going to flood, the tunnel she'd walked into on the sound of moving air. Point was that she'd kept going because stopping had never, not once, felt like the right option. I want to tell you something, she said. He waited. When you rode into the square, she said, I thought you saw something in me that wasn't there. something you'd projected, because you needed a reason to make a choice you'd already decided to make. She paused. I've been waiting for you to discover it wasn't there. I know, he said. I think I'm done waiting for that, she said. He looked at her in the way he looked at most things complete, uncomplicated by performance. Good, he said. She put the letter in her vest pocket and looked at the street. There's a cooperative meeting Tuesday, she said. Harriet has 3 agenda items that are going to take 4 hours. I want you there. I'll be there, he said. And the Galt lumber situation needs to be sorted before the tunnel reinforcement work starts, or we'll be short on the east section. I'll talk to Galt this week. And Teddy is going to panic about the store handover at some point in the next 2 weeks. And I need you to not tell him it'll be fine. He looked at her. Why not? Because it won't necessarily be fine, she said. It'll be hard and then it'll be fine. He needs to know both things or he'll be blindsided by the hard part. She paused. Tell him it'll be hard and then it'll be fine. That's more useful. All right, he said. They walked back toward the store together. In the early summer morning, not touching, not in any hurry, the town going about its business around them, the way towns do indifferent and constant, occasionally wonderful, occasionally terrible, mostly just the ongoing fact of a place where people had decided to be. There were things still unresolved. The Greer appeal at the state level, which Beaumont had filed, and which would take another year or more to settle. The cooperative's second-year budget, which had 3 problems she hadn't fixed yet. Gerald Fitch at the bank, who had become professionally cooperative, but remained personally difficult in the specific way of men who'd been wrong about something and couldn't admit it without discomfort. Her mother's eyes, which had gotten worse over the winter, and which required a trip to the county seat for an examination that her mother kept rescheduling because she didn't want to know. There were things still unresolved. That was not a failure. That was just what an ongoing life looked like when you were in the middle of it, rather than at the clean end of a story. Eliza had spent years waiting to be chosen not for a man or a position or a partnership, but for the simpler thing of being taken seriously in the place where she lived and worked. She'd been waiting for someone to look at what she'd built and recognize it for what it was. And then she'd stopped waiting, not because waiting had become unbearable, but because there was too much work to do. The work had built the thing she'd been waiting to be recognized for. That was the order of it. Not recognition and then work. Work and then recognition slowly, imperfectly, by some people and not others, in some rooms and not others. It was not a satisfying order. It asked more than it should have asked of a person who'd already given a great deal. It was also the true order, in her experience, for people who started where she'd started, who carried the weight of other people's low expectations the way you carry a pack that's too heavy, not because you want to, but because the trail requires you to carry something, and this is what was handed to you. The frontier did not care what you looked like. The flood did not care. Canyon Wall had no opinion about the width of her or the way she fit her sleeves. The tunnel entrance had been exactly the size she'd needed to go through, and she'd gone through it, and that was all there was to say about that. She pushed open the store door, and the bell above it rang, as it had rung every day for 4 years, unchanged, doing its small, reliable job. She went inside. There was work to do.